Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL 2025 Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video to kick off everything you need to know about the Summer Split. I'm very excited to get into this. Obviously, we've had some jam-packed action in the LPL over the course of 2025. Up until this point, it's been a very chaotic and crazy format just in terms of the amount of games that some of these teams are playing, and that certainly doesn't slow down too much going into summer, especially with two teams now eliminated essentially from the LPL, the bottom two teams being, done. No RNG, no OMG coming back here, only 14 teams remaining, and, the groups of Ascend and Nirvana definitely getting a bit more even. I think it makes it even more interesting to talk about where these teams land with Worlds qualification potentially on the line. So hope you guys are excited. I know I am. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. I'm always curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are on all of the players that I'm going to talk about, all the teams that I'm going to talk about. Who am I overrating? Who am I underrating? I don't expect you guys to have the same opinions as me. I never expect you guys to have the same opinions as I do. And so curious to know where you agree and where you disagree, kind of getting a general consensus of my viewers down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's get into the content itself. These primers are usually incredibly long, especially for the LPL, because we go in depth on every single team, and that kind of describes exactly what you can expect out of this video for the rest of the time. We are going to be going from number 14 to number 1 in my personal power rankings, talking about everything you need to know about these teams. That includes every single player, that includes playstyle expectations, that includes ceilings and floors, and just generally what you can expect in terms of their goals and maybe what they want to do. Now, a lot of teams in the LPL decided not to make roster changes going into summer, and so those teams I might talk about a little bit less just because, we have an entire channel backlog of me covering every single game that they played across this year, as we do for every team in the LPL. But there are some teams that have made not just small changes, but some big changes as well, and I think that does raise the first caveat of today's video, which is that I'm recording this on the 17th, on Thursday the 17th, a couple of days before the beginning of the LPL. I will be out of town for the weekend, which means I have to get this video out now. Not every roster is officially announced, and there could potentially still be some roster moves. There are a lot of rumors that are kind of floating around the ether right now. I'll kind of bring those up when I think they're relevant. There are certain teams that are eyeing certain players or have brought players in as a sixth man, and we don't know who's going to be starting, or, could potentially be benching some of their starters, and all of that stuff. We'll kind of go individually and talk about those circumstances when they happen. Just know that if there is a roster change between now and the time the LPL starts, I apologize. I tried to wait as long as possible for these teams to announce their rosters, but as per usual with the LPL, they're behind in everything. They do everything last minute. They never announce their schedule. They never announce their teams. We have to try our best as content creators to actually put out videos, and the LPL never gives us anything to work with. So, again, tried our best, but that's kind of the big caveat, I would say, at the start of the video, but some other ones that you kind of naturally have to go to when you get to a power rankings, a primer video, something like that, where you're giving a lot of opinions. These are just my opinions. That's the main takeaway. Like I said earlier, if you have different opinions than me, that's great. You are going to disagree with something in today's video. If you didn't, I would think you're a robot. There's going to be something here that you're like, that player's too high, or that player's too low, or you're not necessarily giving this team enough credit, or you think this team's too good, and, this team's probably going to do a lot worse than you think they are. There's gonna be something like that in today's video. First and foremost, please disagree with me. I certainly have no qualms about people having different opinions than me. If I was scared of sharing my opinions on the internet, I wouldn't have been doing it for 4 straight years. I get pushback every single year, but I like doing it because it's interesting to see where a lot of people can differ in terms of their thoughts and opinions. But also, if you're off by just a little bit, like if I've got a player at, the 6th best mid laner and you think they're the 8th best mid laner or the 9th best mid laner or even like the 3rd or 4th best mid laner, we're probably not all that far off in terms of where our opinions are. This is a very flexible grading scale, and I think generally speaking, you can realistically move a player up or down 2 or 3 spots, and, I feel pretty good about that. Like, I'm not going to sit there and die on that kind of hill for those kinds of changes. This is generally just where I landed. Same thing for teams, although I think it's a little bit more cut and dry. Towards the bottom of the standings, I think you can make an argument one way or the other because those teams have played so little games over the course of 2025, but generally at the top of the standings, I feel pretty confident in the order I'm at least going to start them in at the beginning of this split. But those are the main caveats. We're going to get into a few more when we get into the actual slides themselves, but we've spent 5 minutes at the start of the video doing the preamble. Let's actually get into things. Like I said, if you are new here, what we're going to do is go 14-1, last to first in terms of my power rankings, talking about each team along the way, grading every team, grading every single player, and ranking them within their own position from number 1 to number 14, and then kind of talking about where I think teams can rise or fall in terms of my expectations as we continue to go along. And that means we start with number 14. Unfortunately, somebody has to come in last, and this is a team that, ironically enough, I do not think will be getting 14th place. I do not think they will be the worst team in Group Nirvana or, in the LPL. I just don't know which team is going to rank below them, so for now, they come in at 14. It is going to be LGD Gaming. I think they have, a higher floor than maybe some of the other teams that we're going to talk about a little bit further, teams like Ultra Prime and LNG, even FunPlus Phoenix, that I think realistically could be at the bottom of the LPL in terms of their actual production. But the problem is, I don't know which of those teams is going to flame out, and so LGD ends up getting the spot at the bottom of the standings, and that's coming off of the fact that they were actually pretty good in the spring split, and that this org has pretty consistently overperformed my expectations, not only this year, but last year as well. It almost feels criminal to bet against them at this point with how much they have consistently not been bad, like actually just been around the 11th or 12th best team in the LPL pretty regularly over the past couple of years. But again, they had a roster change that I don't think necessarily makes them better moving forward, and that does kind of concern me. So let's go ahead and talk about it. First and foremost, let's talk about what you're seeing on the screen. We'll quickly go over kind of the format that you're seeing. Of course, the team at the top, the number, in this case, the 14, next to the team name indicates where I power rank them, 14th in this case. In parentheses, it's going to be how that has changed from the spring primer to now. Not the end of spring, but the beginning of spring. I think that's a more apt comparison to see just exactly how my opinions have changed on a lot of these teams. Obviously LGD is going up because they were 15th in my power rankings going into the spring split, but there aren't even 15 teams anymore. So, it's kind of a funny way to put it, but it's just kind of how things go. You can see how they finished in spring. In LGD's case, they got 12th. They went 4-1 in Group Nirvana. They only played 5 best ofs over the course of that entire stretch, an absolutely ridiculous format. And you can see that they still are in Group Nirvana. As a reminder, for those of you who aren't familiar with the format, the way that this is breaking down is it's still a Group Ascend versus Group Nirvana format, but the split is much more amicable this time. Both teams or both groups get a double round robin rather than Group Ascend getting a double and Group Nirvana getting a single round robin with less teams. And also the split is much more even. The 8 playoff teams are Group Ascend, everyone else is Group Nirvana. So 8 and 6 is a lot more balanced, and that means that teams that were in Group Ascend last split are now in Group Nirvana. Teams like Ninjas in Pyjamas and Thunder Talk Gaming are now in Group Nirvana because they missed the playoffs. And so, there are some bigger opportunities for teams like this to actually show that they can be near the top, 9 or 10 in terms of the power rankings. But I'll list which group they're in there. In LGD's case, of course, Group Nirvana. You can see all 5 of their starting members listed across, the starting line here, if you will. Obviously, this is all subject to change because, again, the LPL just don't really announce their roster changes. And then you can see where I personally rank those players within their own position. In Sasa's case, in the top lane, as we'll get to, he's my number 12 top laner out of 14 in terms of the league right now. And then, of course, in parentheses, how that has changed from the primer and last split in the same way that the power ranking for the team has. I hope that's all explainable. If you see any sort of asterisks or anything like that, we'll discuss that when we get there. That would just denote that the player is taking up an import slot for the team. But for LGD in particular, now that we can finally jump into the actual analysis, their lineup is looking like Sasa in the top lane, Climber in the jungle, Xiaoqinghua in the mid lane, Savior at AD carry, and YCX at support. For those of you confused by who Savior is, it's just Xiaoya, just name swapping. As far as I'm aware, he's going by Savior for this upcoming LPL split. At least that's what the LPL website is telling me, and so I'm going to believe them. Outside of that, no real changes here. It is important to note, Nio is gone. He is going to Ninjas in Pyjamas, which we will talk about, and that means Climber is full on back as the starter here coming into this split. I'm not listing him as a new player for the team because he's not a new player. He played in this team's playoff qualification series. He was supposed to be the starting jungler for them at the beginning of the year, but they ended up wanting to go for somebody that could give them a bit more upside immediately in Nio, and obviously that did end up working out for them. But I do think the floor floor ends up becoming a little bit lower with Climber coming in, but the ceiling is still absolutely there, and we'll touch upon Climber, but we're going to go player by player, kind of quickly touching upon what you can expect from them. I don't want to go super in-depth on these teams that we've talked about all year long, because longtime LPL fans are probably aware of them, but if you are new to the LPL, maybe tuning in to see how Summer Split ends up going, I do want to give you a nice primer as to exactly what you can expect out of these players. That's the whole point of the video. Starting with Sasa in the top lane, this guy's really fun to watch. He's kind of in that crop of top laners in the LPL right now that's very feast or famine, can have really great games, can have really bad games. We've seen both out of him. I think the best games that he had over the course of the last split were genuinely very encouraging and showed that the mechanical talent that he has available to him can really start to blossom and can start to create a lot of interesting scenarios. But man, his bad games are just terrible. When he loses, especially in counter pick matchups, it can get bad really quickly. And so the floor just ends up being naturally a bit lower. That's why he only comes in as my number 12 top laner, even though he would have had games last split that were significantly better than that against players that I think are better than him. I think he does have that kind of mechanical upside. It's just about tapping into that a lot more regularly. We'll skip Climber. We'll get to him because, again, he's kind of the new addition to the starting lineup, even though he's not. Xiaoqinghua in the mid lane is the one player on this team I have the least amount of confidence in. I'll be honest, watching tape back for the spring split here to get ready for this primer video, his tape was awful. Like, it really is just not very good. The numbers are okay. Like, they don't lead you to believe that he's going to be the worst mid laner in the entire league, but man, the eye test certainly shows a player that struggles to be able to maintain his own consistency in the mid lane. He's not really great at anything. Right now, his laning is subpar. His ability to shove and roam is pretty subpar, especially because you're playing off of a jungler that, you know, they didn't work together particularly well when they played at the beginning of last year. Obviously, they've had success together in the LDL, but I just was not impressed with Xiaoqinghua in terms of how he played the game. My expectation for him coming into this split is that he will be the weak link of this team, and if they are going to get held back and actually be closer to like number 14, number 13, bottom of group Nirvana, it's probably because mid lane is kind of a weakness for this team, and you don't really have other players that I think are dominant enough to be able to really carry that unless, again, jungle ends up stepping up. You have the bot lane here with Savior and YCX. They're fine. Savior impressed me at times last split, so did YCX. There were a couple of games where I could definitely see the upside and the potential. Are they superstars? No, I don't really see mechanical like upside in them as a duo in terms of being able to rise above like the 12th or 11th best bot lane in the LPL. Maybe it does end up happening. YCX, I think, has some interesting traits to him, but I'm a little bit lower on him as a player and as a prospect than maybe some other people are. Generally, I just see this as your stereotypical slightly below average bot lane. They're slightly below average at everything. The lucky thing for them is that Group Nirvana means they'll be going up against a lot of the other bad bot lanes in the LPL, and they're going to be fine at holding their own against, you know, bot lanes that are really underperforming. We saw that last split, but if you ask them to go up against like Group Ascend level talent, I just don't think they're anywhere close to that kind of mechanical ceiling. And then you've got Climber coming in and starting in the jungle. Climber was awesome in the LDL. Let's say it how it is. And a lot of these players were awesome in the LDL. There's a reason that LGD was so successful in the LDL last year and that they felt comfortable to promote a lot of the players from their LDL team immediately into the main roster. But Climber really was the engine that kind of made the entire thing go. From what I was noticing, that just wasn't the case at the beginning of the year. It really felt like he had a lot of trouble finding his form. And it's funny because I do think that's kind of been a trend for a lot of junglers. You either, you know, explode on the scene early on and can't quite maintain your form, or you're kind of mediocre up and down a little bit in your rookie year, and then it takes you going into year 2 to actually really put everything together. Nayo for this team is a great example of that. Xiao Fong, who we'll talk about for LNG, was potentially another example of that. The big one is Monkey across this split for WE, who took some time to obviously figure out, you know, what he wanted to be and then ended up getting better. You know, Climber's being given an opportunity to potentially come back into this team, having learned a little bit, having, you know, been benched and, you know, been given an opportunity to grow, and now we'll see where he's at. I don't expect him to really be able to break through right now, but I still think this is a guy who has a lot of upside and potential as a really good jungler at this level. And, you know, like I said, from experience, we know that it takes some time to actually be able to really adapt to the LPL, where the pace is incredibly quick and it's very difficult for junglers to play, especially because so many of them come up through the system being really good from ahead and really bad from behind. You know, one of those feast or famine types of jungle prospects. Like Climber can kind of fall into that as well. But if he can find his upside, I think he has the highest upside of anybody on this team, and him coming in, I think, is a positive. And overall, it makes me feel better about LGD that they are just full committing to this. Technically, Meteor is still on the roster if everything goes poorly, but I'm pretty sure he's just transitioning into a coaching role for the most part for them. This looks like it is going to be the starting 5. There's no rumors of anybody else joining this team for now, and so for LGD, LGD, while I think their floor is kind of low because it's a bunch of players that I just don't think are like, above average in their position, especially in terms of what they've proven so far in the LPL. They've already shown that they can play well as a team, and I think it's pretty realistic to expect at least one of these players to have a really good split that we're not expecting, whether that be Climber, whether that be Savior, whether that be Sasa, even Xiao Qinghua in the mid lane, I think is definitely kind of a candidate for something like that. Somebody's going to emerge for LGD. They basically always do. We'll just have to see who it is. Then moving on to number 13 in my power rankings, and this is probably the team that most people are going to have at 14 in terms of where they're at, because this team was the closest to being at the bottom of the standings in spring. It's Ultra Prime, who comes in at number 13 for me. I do think that on paper, they just have more interesting pieces than LGD do, but again, like if Climber's really good, if they can figure something out with Sasa, and if the bot lane can survive, then I think, LGD could be fine. Ultra Prime was the closest to being out of the actual, summer split here as we head out of spring. They were 2 and 3 in Group Nirvana. They really kind of held on by the skin of their teeth, although I will say credit to them. They started off Group Nirvana very well, which meant that it would have taken a catastrophic collapse in order for them to be a bottom 2 team, but they came very, very close, narrowly ended up making that a reality for themselves. But they come back with one kind of change. I mean, it is a change, right? He only played one game across the entirety of the spring split. I certainly wouldn't have considered him a starter or anything like that, and so you have a new AD carry coming in, hopefully that can raise the floor of what this team is, and I think there are pieces on this team that I genuinely like, so we'll go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Jung in the top lane, Junhao in the jungle, Saber in the mid lane, Baya at AD carry, and Xiaoxia at support. This is a pretty interesting team from a mechanical perspective because there are players here that I think were really good in Spring Split. I think specifically Junhao is the one player that you really have to look at in the jungle as really being a carry force for Ultra Prime, which is so fun to see. It's kind of weird to say, but we just talked about how it takes some time for junglers to kind of figure themselves out. I know Winter was such a small sample size, and there's really not a lot that you can take out of that Winter split because there was really a very little amount of games, especially for teams that weren't very good. But Junhao was a horrible in the Winter split. It felt like he was starting off the Spring split rather poorly when it came to that first section, kind of the placement stage, the group stage of the Winter split before we separated into Group Ascend and Group Nirvana. But Junhao, once he got into Group Nirvana, and even really at the end of that group stage at the beginning of spring, he really started to turn it on. And by the end of the split, like, he was probably the best jungler in Group Nirvana. He really was playing at that kind of level. He looked like somebody who could actively carry games in the LPL, which was really exciting. Now, there are a lot of caveats to go alongside that. First and foremost, he was one of like the early adopters and abusers of Neferi when that champion was completely out of control and, before she ended up getting nerfed. And so there are some, like how much of that was him, how much of that was the champion kind of arguments that I think you can make towards Junhao. And I think also worth noting that by the time he was starting to move away from the Neferi and start to go to other carry champions, he was really going up against like bad teams pretty regularly. He wasn't playing against actually good players really all that consistently at all. But Junhao was kind of the carry for Ultra Prime. And if you're going to look for somebody that can still, grow and kind of grow alongside the team, I think Junhao is the player that you're looking at there. And that's the reason that this team comes in at number 13 for me, because I do think Junhao is the most interesting player on Ultra Prime versus LGD, who I don't think have a player that interesting from my perspective. The other interesting players on this team, I think Saber had some interesting moments. I'm using the word interesting a lot, and I know it's probably annoying at this point, but it really is an apt word to use because I don't think it's necessarily like good or bad, just like intriguing in terms of the way that they ended up playing. Saber had some, very, very aggressive moments. I think what we saw is that this player is not going to be particularly passive, and I think at times that can be really positive for the team. He doesn't have insane mechanics, but his mechanics are pretty solid. I think that there is a universe where he could end up breaking out and being like a top 10 or a top 9 mid laner at some point. Maybe not this year, but at some point in his career, I do think he has that kind of play style. He definitely fits the mold of those more aggressive, like melee-oriented mid laners. He wants to play things like Yone and Akali and, things like that. He definitely fills that void, but he can also branch out maybe a bit more than someone like Strive, who was in a similar spot like a couple of years ago where he was kind of pigeonholed as that melee carry in the mid lane. Saber has a lot more to do when he's on those typical control mages, which I think obviously is really good overall for him. But while I don't think he's a superstar, I think there's something to build off of there, and I think the mid-jungle duo's not all that, like, bad for Ultra Prime, all things considered. It's everything else that I think has some question marks. You have Xiaoxia coming back into the support position. He had some awesome games across the spring split. There were some moments where I was crazy impressed with him, some moments where he was just okay, but as a support, I really look for highlight plays on bad teams. Obviously, consistency is really good, but if your low moments aren't absolutely catastrophic, like, Vampire had high moments on Edward Gaming and on Invictus last year, but his low moments were so bad that it was hard to really kind of, count that. Xiaoxi is one of those players that his high moments were really solid, and his low moments really weren't all that bad. He just didn't have a ton of high moments because this team wasn't very good at playing around him, but he's a playmaker. He's somebody who, again, I could see a universe where he turns into a pretty good support at this level. And Zheng's the last player who's kind of returning here for Ultra Prime. I had a lot of promise for him coming into the year because he was so fun to watch in the PCS last year for FunPlus Esports, and that just has not translated at all. I think you can make an argument that he has been the worst performing top laner so far in 2025. I'm not going to make that argument. He comes in second to last for me in terms of the players that are still playing. Obviously, we'll get to the one player that I've just completely lost faith on, but Zheng has not been the impressive kind of top lane player that I was looking for. I thought his individual 1v1 mechanics were insane in the PCS. That is not translated at all so far to the LPL, even when he is going up against worse competition. In Group Nirvana, we've seen players come over there. You Should Know Me is kind of the big example where, that dominant, more mechanically aggressive style top lane presence just isn't translatable to the LPL, where the pace of play is just so much higher than it is in the PCS. I think Zheng is really struggling with that, but you have the new player, the one new player coming in for Ultra Prime here in Baya in the AD carry role. Baya is a player that's intriguing. I think, obviously, we don't know a ton about him. I'm lucky enough where I was on the official or the unofficial cast for his one game that he played over the course of the spring split, and he looked pretty good in that game. I think there are some fun takeaways, but it really is like a to be determined. Let's see what he turns into. Wako wasn't exactly lighting the world on fire for Ultra Prime, another player coming over from the PCS who just could not find that form. Baya, I think, theoretically, could give you some upside here, but for now it's basically impossible to rank him anything other than the last AD carry coming into this split because we just have no idea what he's going to be. But I do think that there are pieces of this team that give me hope that they could turn into something more. Junhao, I think, is a very interesting carry. If he can keep his performances up from what he was in the spring split, that's really positive. Saber, I think, still has some room to grow. Xiaoxia, I think, is a player that I think really could turn into something. Zheng in the top lane, I think, has a mechanical ceiling. He could theoretically unlock something that he has not yet shown in the LPL in particular because his other tape was good. If Baya can just be a passable AD carry, this team can be around like a number 10 or number 11 or something like that, like mid-table in Group Nirvana. I don't think anybody would really be all that upset by that kind of ranking, but again, if this team ended up flaming out and going 14th and being the worst team in the LPL, I also don't think I'm going to be surprised by that outcome either. But that's going to bring us to our first Group Ascend team of this video, coming in at number 12 for me, and it really is a team that I just have no clue what we're going to get out of them. It's FunPlus Phoenix coming in at number 12, one of the few teams to make drastic changes from spring going into summer for a team that overperformed what my expectations were. It just feels like a crazy set of circumstances. Once again, it feels like ownership and management is really pushing out a lot of players from this system, and, I just don't have a lot of faith that it's going to make them better or it's going to put them in a better spot, and obviously we'll go ahead and talk about that, but you're bringing in two incredibly unknown and unproven players, at least at the LPL level, and I just have no idea what you're going to get out of a majority of this roster. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Sheer in the top lane, Aya, like tell me how to pronounce this in the comment section below. I have no clue how to pronounce this. I'm going to call him Aya for the rest of this video because I think that makes the most sense in my brain in terms of just how this goes, but please illuminate to me exactly how you would say this name. Care in the mid lane, Jiachi in the AD carry role, and Hong Hong at support. I believe it will be Hong Hong at support. That's at the very least what I'm going to say here. Jue is still on the roster, but trust me, we'll get into just what happened in the mid-season here for FPX that completely obliterated this team. I guess we can get into it now, right? So FPX wanted to make a change. They wanted to bring in a new AD carry, and Jiachi was available. RNG obviously not participating in the LPL this split. They're supposed to be participating in the LDL, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen either. RNG just might be cooked as an organization. In fact, I would think that that's relatively likely. So Jiachi was looked at as a potential upgrade for FPX from Assume, who just wasn't playing all that well for this team. Let's be entirely honest. I've been pretty anti-Assume not only this year, but for a majority of his career. I've just never really bought into the hype that everybody wanted to put on him. I thought he was fine, like the definition of a slightly below average AD carry, but not somebody that I ever thought was going to grow into something more. So FPX wanted to go out and kind of change around at AD carry to potentially upgrade, and Jiachi came in. Now, that started this whole train of events because, as it would turn out, FPX didn't address any of the players when making this decision, and so a lot of them ended up being blindsided and weren't exactly expecting to have a change in the roster after making playoffs in the spring split. So Shadow ends up leaving. I'm not sure if that was going to happen either way, but Shadow ends up leaving FPX. We'll talk about him a bit later. He's rumored to go to a couple of different teams right now, but that means they have to promote the FPX Blaze jungler, Aye, or however you want to say it, to the jungle position. Okay, that's a bit of a problem because this guy has almost no experience playing at any competitive level outside of this year, and that really sets off Jway. Like, this whole series of events, Jway is very close with Assume in terms of just, how he likes to play with him, and, he wanted to play with him as his AD carry, and obviously Assume leaving wasn't great, but especially going behind Jway's back to replace Assume really pissed off Jway, who wanted to try out for other teams. He reportedly tried out for LGD Gaming and, for a couple of other teams as well, but that didn't go well, and FPX, as punishment for this player going and trying out for other teams while he's contracted to FPX, seems to be benching Jway. Now, if that doesn't happen, awesome. This team is infinitely better than this number 12 ranking. They're a lot closer to being number 10 or number 9 or somewhere around that area if they bring back their all-pro caliber support. But right now, as it would seem, they have rookies in the jungle and in the support position, both of whom have very little experience, all things considered, when it comes to actually playing. You're side grading at best when it comes to AD carry. Maybe this could be an upgrade going forward because I think Jiachi has some sort of upside, and then poor Sheer and Care are just going to have to kind of deal with it. So that's kind of the big explanation for maybe what happened in the offseason here for FPX, but quickly going over what you can expect from this team. The solo laners are still positives, especially Sheer on the top side. Now, one thing to note about Sheer, I love him as a player. I think he has a ton of upside, and obviously I think there's a lot to build off of there, but this is a player who started off 2025 very strong, was good in winter, was very good at the start of spring, really was the reason that FPX was in Group Ascend at all at the beginning of spring, and then wasn't quite as dominant once we started getting into the actual Group Ascend stage and he started going up against really good top laners regularly. It didn't really feel like Sheer, especially in the back half of the split, was able to maintain that kind of momentum. And right now, he's going to have to be the best player on this team, pretty much no questions asked, and that's a lot to ask from a player who, while kind of experienced at this point, still has a lot less competitive experience than basically everybody else on this team. I should say that, but he probably has the third most competitive experience outside of Care and Jiachi on this team, which is not a great sign. But if Sheer's going to have to be your number 1 guy, that's a bit of a difficult place to be. And I think even more concerning is that Care probably has to be your number 2 in the mid lane. I'm notoriously lower on Care. I just don't really see high-end upside out of him as a player. I did in 2023. That's something that I really went to bat for. But after last year, I was really out on what Care was going to become as a mid lane prospect. And I think at this point, we really know who Care is. He is your definition of a league average mid laner. He's going to be fine enough to be able to play like your B-. You feel okay about him being like your 3rd or 4th best player, ideally your 5th best player if you're trying to actually make the playoffs. But if he's going to be your 2nd best player, that's a lot to ask out of Care, who I just don't think is consistent in any way, and I certainly don't think he has the mechanical upside to compete regularly in Group Ascend with a lot of the other mid laners. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I just don't think that Care can be your number 2, and that really concerns me. And then everything else on this team is a huge question mark. Jiachi comes in playing AD carry. He was fine for RNG. I think he was somebody who did get more comfortable the more he played for that team, but again, very small sample size when it comes to a lot of the Group Nirvana teams. He's going to have to step in and be a pretty big piece. He was basically the 2nd or 3rd option on RNG, maybe even the 1st option for a lot of times already for that team, so he's not going to feel overwhelmed kind of being that for FPX, but I do think there's probably more responsibility on him than he expected when he joined this team. That I will definitely say. Kind of a Kaisa merchant, at least for now. Hopefully he can grow into something a bit more than that. And then you've got the 2 rookies. I honestly don't really have anything to say. IE in the jungle is somebody that I think could theoretically be playable, but it's certainly not an ideal set of circumstances. This is a pretty massive downgrade from Shadow, who is a very good jungler at this level. Even if he is very feast or famine, can have some pretty bad games, he at least has the good games to be able to balance that out. But i.e., how does he come in at anything other than 14th in terms of my jungle rankings? And the same thing for Hong Hong coming into the support position. Again, if this is Jway and now all of a sudden you're looking at, Jiachi Jway as a bot lane, I think you could make a reasonable argument that this team is better than the next 2 or 3 teams that we're going to talk about in this video, and they certainly aren't going to be this far below even other Group Nirvana teams as a Group Ascend team. But with Jway out and with Hong Hong in, this guy doesn't even have a picture on Leaguepedia. That's the point we're at with the starting support here, and it does look like at the very least he is going to be playing a little bit at the start of the year for FPX. How can I rank him anything other than the 14th best support? This team is just one massive question mark. There's a chance that they are the worst team in the LPL LPL right now, and that even though they're in Group Ascend, they would be at the bottom of Group Nirvana anyways. But I do think there is enough talent on this team for me to believe that they have a floor with Sheer, Care, and Jiachi in terms of their core, but like whatever you're getting out of the rest of this team could be massively bad, and FPX does feel like a team that's pretty heavily downgraded from anything they were before this. Then moving on to number 11 in my power rankings, and this is a team that's pretty difficult to pin down because obviously they're underperforming their talent level so much. It's LNG Esports. This was a team we had actual expectations for at the beginning of the year. Obviously, those were entirely misplaced. This roster was doomed to start, doomed to begin with, and everything has really collapsed for LNG. A lot of these players have regressed back to the worst versions of themselves, and I just don't really see a way out for them. They did look better down the stretch than they did at the beginning of the split once they changed out their junglers, as we all could have expected, which I'll obviously talk about here. But if this is going to be the same 5 that goes into the summer split here, I don't really expect them to be able to break out and all of a sudden become like a top 8 or 9 team like we expected them to be at the beginning of the year. Their lineup is looking like Zika in the top lane, Xiaofeng in the jungle, Haichao in the mid lane, LP at AD carry, and Zhuo at support. Obviously, some pluses and some minuses for a team like this. The big plus is still Zika in the top lane. Like, this guy's crazy good. It's actually absurd that this guy is on this team. It feels disrespectful, but I think if he were to go to a JD Gaming right now, or even like, shout out Invictus, I think the Shy was fine, but like, if he were to go to a place like Invictus or JD Gaming or, something like that, like, would he be an upgrade immediately? Yes. Like, WE, would they not love to have a player like this? Absolutely. They're trying to go to Worlds, and Zika's a player that should be trying to go to Worlds. Unfortunately, he's mega stuck on LNG here. He showed all the positives of why we thought he was a top tier player for many years previously, why he's been going to Worlds. He showed all of that in the previous split in spring. It just didn't really matter. You can dominate the top lane matchup. You can be 5-0-0 up 3,000 gold on your own, and your team can still run it down. And that's kind of just the case for what's happening with Zika. He's stuck on this team. But if you want to carry, if you want somebody to look at that you can enjoy watching when you're watching LNG games, it's absolutely the top side of the map here. And it's not just him. I do think Xiaofeng in the jungle is another player that you really have to watch out for. He kind of came in and revitalized the team in terms of their ability to win and play fast. It was really cool to see because this was a guy who I think had some bad moments when he first entered the league on OMG, but also had some really good ones. I was kind of a fan of his last year when we were talking in 2024. I thought he had a lot of upside to him, and I was kind of surprised that he didn't have a job. Going into 2025, he ends up being the replacement here for Weiwei, who, if you guys have followed this channel for any amount of time, you'll know that I think Weiwei is maybe one of the most overrated players in LPL history. This guy was basically never good and was constantly getting carried, but that's for another conversation. Xiaofeng obviously came in and just completely revitalized what LNG was capable of doing, and his aggressive tendencies and his ability to carry, I think, is really what this team was looking for. They needed somebody on this team that could play like an actual damage dealer, regularly winning games, because that's certainly not what Weiwei was going to be doing for this team. So glad they're bringing him back. Obviously, this team looked better with him. Haichao is still here in the mid lane, and the unfortunate thing is it feels like 2024 was a complete outlier for him as a player. He was really bad before 2024. I was willing to give up on him at the beginning of the year in 2024. For those of you who don't remember, I had him as my number 16 mid laner. I was kind of lambasting LGD for bringing him back for yet another year, I think 3 years in a row as a starting mid laner for that team, because he had never really shown the growth that we were looking for, and he really broke out last year. Like, he was very good for LGD, had a ton of moments where I think he was actively carrying the team, and he comes over here to LNG and things just fall right back apart. He was just as bad as he was ever on LGD when he was, playing in 2022 and 2023. So if that's going to be the version of Haichao that we are getting moving forward, yeah, he's going to be a bottom 1, bottom 2 mid laner in the league, and that is just a disappointing outcome because this team had high expectations, I think, for him coming into the year, but all of those expectations, I think, have been, underperformed at this point, and until he does anything else, there's just no reason for me to rank him outside of number 13. And then you've got the bot lane here, LP and Zhuo. LP obviously coming in midway through the split as well for Photic. That was a hugely necessary decision. Talk about another player that I had considered consistently talked shit on this channel. All due respect to like all the Photic fans out there. Go back and watch my 2022 analysis of Photic when he was on that Victory 5 team with Rookie and with PP God. I was sitting there calling him overhyped and overrated back then, and I was getting a lot of pushback in the comment section. Really, the only comments on my LPL videos back in the day were just people telling me that I was too low on Photic, but I continued to stand my ground. I just never saw it on tape. It felt like he was benefiting a lot from other players having pressure, not necessarily he himself creating that pressure. And obviously he ends up, you know, being on that Ninjas in Pyjamas team for a couple of years, was probably the worst player in the LPL in 2023. Certainly had an argument for being the worst player in the LPL. He was at times okay last year, but certainly was awful in the summer split when it really ended up mattering. He comes over here to LNG and he's once again terrible. This guy has been bad, like objectively bad for years. It was finally time for him to get replaced, and LP was the one to come in and do it. Now, LP is another player that I pushed against for a very long time. You know, LNG fans will remember when he was brought onto this team to try and make Worlds, and obviously that wasn't going to happen. He ends up being traded for Gala. What a good move for LNG to try to get themselves and successfully get themselves to the World Championships a couple of years ago, but quite frankly, LP just doesn't have that kind of upside. This is a high-ish floor, like a medium floor, low ceiling type of player. He's never really going to have those dominant pop-off performances. Theoretically, he should be more stable than Photic, because Photic is just not stable at all as an AD carry player, but LP is not somebody that impresses me or gets me excited about watching him play AD carry. Like, do I think he's better than Photic? Probably. Do I think he's going to help this team win? No. Joao is a very hard player to evaluate, though, because I'm so low on Photic, and Photic and Joao have basically played their entire careers together. It's really difficult for me to form an opinion on him individually as a support. There have been flashes that have looked really good from him as a player, and generally support's pretty weak. I think generally the talent level of the LPL went down going into this split, especially at the bottom of the standings, which is not what you want to hear going into, you know, a split where two teams have been eliminated and theoretically the worst players should have exited the league. Like, Joao is a player that is rising +1 in terms of the rankings because the league has gotten worse, and generally because supports just aren't as consistent anymore. But this is a player that has never shown any consistency in terms of his ability to actually play well for an extended period of time. He'll have games every once in a while, and I am glad for him to finally be separated from Photic as a player, because I think Joao has more to offer as a support than Photic does as an AD carry. But again, I can't really give him an endorsing sign. So what does this team do? Well, they hope Xiao Feng in the jungle can actually just win games for this team, can be able to carry. You're hoping and praying that Hai Chao can get some of that form back and that him and Joao can actually play well, that LP can be stable, and that Zika can be a carry on the top side of the map. But all of these things kind of have to happen in order for this team to even be competent and relevant. I think parts of that happened at the end of last split, which was encouraging, and that's why they come in at number 11 for me. But still, for now, it's very difficult for me to say anything other than LNG is looking like a mid to lower tier table team in Group Nirvana. Probably not a team that will be competing with the upper echelon. Then coming in at number 10 for me in my power rankings, we start to get to teams in Group Nirvana that I think could theoretically make some noise if everything were to go right, and that kicks off with LGD Gaming coming in at number 10 for me. I still believe in this team, like talent-wise. I still think that there are enough players on this roster that could figure things out, that have shown good traits, like elite traits at the LPL level before, that if everything were to click, like maybe they can get like a top 7 or a top 8 kind of finish. It's just harder and harder for me to believe that that's going to be the case. I do think they have some time to figure things out. Of course, in Group Nirvana for an entirety of a split, like for double round robin, you could theoretically farm some wins off of some pretty bad teams, and so maybe that ends up being something that really helps this team moving forward. But at least for now, they haven't shown anything as a group, as a unit, that leads me to believe that they're going to overperform this. Do I think they're top 3 in Group Nirvana? Yeah, I do think they're probably top 3. They're better probably than LNG and then, you know, Ultra Prime and, you know, all these other teams, LGD. Like, they're probably better than those teams, but are they good enough to be top 2? That is to be determined. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like ZDZ in the top lane, Xiaohao in the jungle, Angel in the mid lane, On at AD carry, and Perukia, I believe, at support. This is one of the caveats that I have to give from a roster perspective. In the same way that we don't really know who's starting for FPX in their support position, we don't really know who's starting for EDG in their support position. Perukia was, of course, playing for EDG Youth in Asia Masters and the LDL and all of those tournaments, and teams, it looks like he's going to be brought up to be the starting support. EDG obviously losing their support to JD Gaming midway through the offseason. They didn't have a lot of time to be able to figure something out. I'm sure this team would have wanted to go get a veteran of some sort, and maybe they will still be looking for somebody that's available. Obviously, you know, somebody like Missing is now available. I believe he's looking closer to retirement than he is to actually jumping in, but there are some supports that are teamless right now that I think could theoretically be pick-upable. Maybe someone like PP God, who is also available right now, could be an option for this team, but for now, it does look like it's going to be their young EDG youth support that is stepping in to start for this team at the start of the split. So we'll kind of talk about how that impacts their rankings in general. But the positives with this team, I think, are pretty obvious. First and foremost, I got to shout out my guy. Xiao Hao is still on this team starting in the jungle. This guy's my GOAT. Like, he's like the channel darling in the LPL for me at this point. He's somebody that I continue to go to bat for basically every single year. I think that there were a ton of moments for Edward Gaming where he was just actively winning them games this past split. Although I don't think it was quite as obvious as it was in previous years. Like, when you looked at the Rare Adam year, it's like, oh yeah, he was winning a lot of games for that team. Obviously, he did not get a good run for it on Weibo Gaming, but, you know, we'll talk about it in a second. This guy always has kind of been the secret, like, king of summer in terms of how he performs in the LPL, but going back to those Anyone's Legend teams from previously, like, he was always carrying this team, being a borderline all-pro caliber player throughout parts of splits for AL, and just never really got the results to be able to kind of back that up because the rest of his team was quite bad. But Xiao Hao is a player that I still rate very highly. I still think in the right circumstance, he could be on a top tier team and make an actual impact. It's funny because BLG is constantly looking for somebody to come in and solve their jungle woes. Well, Xiao Hao is a player that I think would come in and really just upgrade the team almost immediately. He could be pretty similar to Shun in terms of just exactly what you're looking for as a starting jungler, but alas, you know, he's probably never going to get that opportunity again after the Weibo Gaming stint, whether earned or unearned. This guy can play tanks, he can play carries, he can do a little bit of everything. I'm a big fan of his. I think he's an actively great piece for this team to have, and I do think they have very experienced, successful players on this team. Angel in the mid lane has made a World Finals before, obviously in 2020 with Suning, but like, he's a very different player now. He had his downward trajectory after that World Finals appearance where he was kind of the, you know, carried member of that team, if we're being entirely honest in terms of how they played, and then he had his re-emergence. He ends up having a really bad stint on RNG with him and Tong Yuan kind of trading games back and forth. He goes over to Ninjas in Pyjamas just to kind of, you know, maybe play out the rest of the year and just generally kind of fill some time and fill some spots for that team, and he really breaks out. Him and Shadow play excellently off of each other on that Ninjas in Pyjamas team. He goes over to OMG. And while he wasn't as good as he was on NIP, I still think he was pretty good for OMG last year. He's not been able to find that form on Edward Gaming. This is his weakest year in quite a long time. This honestly does remind me of Suning Angel, just in terms of his ability to not take over the game. He's a really good shove and row mid laner, but he is not a carry player, and I think that that is disappointing to see at the top end level because he kind of does need to be that here for Edward Gaming. But you also have on this team. Talk about a player that I had really high expectations for coming into the year. Obviously was teamless at the start of the year, which was absolutely ridiculous, but ends up coming back in here to start in the AD carry role for this team. Of course he did, because he's the best option they had available to him. Unfortunately for them, he was clearly not in LPL form coming back. He was really slow to get going in terms of finding his way back into being comfortable at this level. This was someone who at certain times I was calling a top 5 or top 6 AD carry in the LPL in terms of the production he was able to put out, even on bad teams, especially on bad teams when he was receiving resources, but it just didn't really click. Him and Wink had great chemistry previously. That did not carry through to the beginning of this split. He's now going to need to step up again. He's going to need to be better than he was in spring, and he's going to need to do it with a rookie support, which is tough. But those are the positives. If this team is going to outperform this number 10 ranking or even live up to this number 10 ranking, you know, Xiao Hao is going to have to be his summer self, which I think is pretty likely that we can expect to happen. And Angel and On have to be good enough to be carry threats for this team. But it's the other two members that I don't trust. ZDZ's coming in as my last ranked top laner, number 14. I've completely given up on this guy. He's just not good. Like, I think especially in a meta now where you have to lane, like lane swaps are obviously coming back and people have figured out how to do them in the current meta, but you still have to like be able to survive 1v1 against opposing top laners. ZDZ cannot do that as a player, and honestly, I've said it on this channel once, I'll say it again. ZDZ better be like thanking Xiao Hao for everything he has, because Xiao Hao keeps getting him jobs over and and over again as his top laner. You know, whether it's on Anyone's Legend or Weibo Gaming or now here on Edward Gaming, it just feels like he's following him around everywhere he goes, and I'm not sure ZDZ would have lasted this long in the LPL if that was not the case. And so, you know, at this point, I've completely given up on him. I just do not think he's a playable top laner at this level. And then you have Pyjamas, who, again, like, I know little about. Like, I got to watch some EDG youth. It's unlike the FPX, you know, players that were coming out that have shown basically nothing, especially Hong, the other support that I kind of have to rate. He's shown actually nothing in terms of his pro career, but Pyjamas is a player that I actually have gotten to see some tape of. He seems fine. He was okay for EDG youth. I was watching the Asia Masters, gameplay tape of him, and, you know, there were some moments where he looked pretty solid in terms of how that tournament ended up going. Do I think he looks incredible? No, like, I don't think he looks like a top-tier support prospect, but he's certainly somebody that I think could theoretically, you know, be fine at this level, especially if he's getting introduced with veterans like On and Angel and Xiao Hao in the jungle. And so, you know, Pyjamas is not the player I'm the most concerned about, ironically, on this team. That's probably ZDZ, but if the bot lane continues to be bad, certainly if they regress even more from what they were now that Wink is gone and you have a rookie support coming in, I could see EDG kind of, you know, not being top 3 in Group Nirvana, but I would be surprised if they were a bottom 2 team in the LPL if they didn't end up making, like, the qualification, you know, process for the playoffs, because I just don't think that the core talent level on this team is worse than, like, the bottom 2 teams in the LPL will be. So for Edward Gaming, I'm expecting them to be fine, maybe not breakthrough stars that are going to make the playoffs or fight for top 8 or anything like that. I think the ship has sailed on the team kind of turning into that, but basically being exactly what they were in spring, which was a tough out for bad teams and, you know, a team that kind of gatekeeps the good ones away from themselves. But then moving on now to number 9 in my power rankings, and this is a team that has consistently both over and underperformed their own expectations throughout this year. It's Thunder Talk Gaming, who find themselves in an interesting position coming into this primer and coming into the summer split, because honestly, we were really starting to turn around our opinion on Thunder Talk, where it really felt like this team was kind of establishing themselves as a top 8 team in the LPL, as a team you had to watch out for that could make playoffs, that was likely to make playoffs, that was continuing to grow. Like, all of that stuff was happening throughout the end of winter, beginning of spring. It really felt like Thunder Talk was here to stay. And then, of course, they lose their jungler. They lose Beichuan to BLG, who ends up going on to make a pretty big difference for that team. And Thunder Talk can't really recover from that spot. They can't really ever find their own footing again. I think it was kind of exposed just how important Beichuan was to that starting roster and just how important he was to the macro and general vibes of the team and the ability to kind of lead from that situation, the long-standing member of Thunder Talk Gaming. And the moment they lost him, the moment I started losing confidence in what this team could become, especially because I wasn't in love with his replacement. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is still looking like Hoya in the top lane, Xiao Hongren in the jungle, Seitab in the mid lane, 1xN at AD carry, and Feather at support. We can start from good and go to bad. That's typically how I like to structure these and kind of how I like to order them. The good for this team is absolutely the bot lane. That's where you're going to be looking at them generating the most amount of advantages for themselves. But even then, I'm still a bit lower on this bot lane in comparison to some other analysts. I just don't know if I'm all in on this duo ever really being like a top 4 or top 5 bot lane in the LPL. I just don't really know if that's ever going to happen from my perspective. I will say, though, they are the strength of this team, and so if they are going to outperform this number 9 ranking, it's almost certainly going to be through these two on the bottom side of the map. Feather is the one that I'm definitely more sold on. Feather is a genuinely good support at this level. Do I think he's incredible? No, he doesn't feel like a support that's going to break through and ever really become like a superstar, but do I think he can be a top 5 or 6 support at this level, especially when other supports are underperforming? Yeah, I think Feather is going to have times where he looks like a top 5-ish support in the LPL, which I think is a really strong place to be. He was a prospect that I really liked when he first was coming through, I believe, the Rare Atom system, many years ago, but never really found his footing. Didn't look good in his small tenure here for Thunder Talk in certain circumstances, but finally gets a big run of it here in 2025, and I think really is starting to kind of come into that promise that we saw when he first was coming through. Support is a position I usually do pretty well with on this channel, so hopefully Feather continues to be a positive piece for Thunder Talk, but everybody's really high on 1xN as a player. I'm much more neutral on him, and I don't want it to seem like I'm anti-1xN. I think I've turned around my thoughts and opinions on that. They've definitely raised from the beginning of the year to what they are now. I no longer think he's just a guy. He's not a jag, if you will, in the AD carry role, just a guy. I don't think he necessarily represents that, but do I think he's like the definition of a league average AD carry at this level? Yeah, kinda. And do I think that that's good enough to actually win some games, even in like Group Ascend? Yeah, that's probably good enough, because so many of these teams, and especially bot lanes, just underperform so consistently that having a player who you can reliably count on to be good at that level That's totally fine. Like, you looked at someone like Assume for FPX, and you couldn't really rely on him being good at this level, and so somebody like 1XM was definitely more valuable than him. But do I think he has, like, crazy upside in terms of what he could become as an AD carry? I've never really seen that. I don't think the mechanics are really all that out of this world. I think he's very stable, I think he's very secure, and I think he's pretty clinical in terms of his execution. He's good in most phases of the game, but he doesn't really have that killer instinct that I think a lot of the top AD carries have had over the course of his career, and I do think that's why he's never really been able to break through, statistically speaking, into that upper echelon. Now, again, part of that is because he plays for Thunder Talk, but we've seen players on this team break through before, UCal in particular having incredible stats and incredible splits, and 1XN just doesn't feel like he has the same kind of impact as somebody like UCal had previously on Thunder Talk. So while I do think he's good, he's going to come in at number 9 for me because there are better AD carries, in my opinion, in the LPL. And honestly, that's the most positive part of this conversation when it comes to Thunder Talk Gaming, because the solo laners are very difficult to judge. Satab will have some incredibly good games, and honestly has already shown more positive traits here than he ever did in the LCK for DRX. He's shown a lot more of what we saw in the Challengers League when he was playing for DRX Challengers, you know, a couple of years ago now. But Satab is a player that also will have the worst games you've ever seen in your entire life. You want to talk about the lowest of lows in terms of what you can expect out of Satab? He still absolutely brings those, especially against good competition. We've seen him in these big best of 3s and best of 5s go up against some of the best mid laners in the league and get absolutely obliterated by them very consistently. Now, can he hold his own against middle to lower tier mid laners and mid laners that are struggling in terms of being able to push advantages early in particular? Yeah, I think that that's possible, but for a player in Satab who really relies on gold leads in the early game to even really participate in the game, he's just not someone you can, you know, feel good about coming out of the mid lane, especially when you're trying to compete for top 8 or top 7 or something like that. And then there's Hoya on the top side, who does have a little bit more going for him than maybe I expected. I'm trying to find a middle ground of what I thought he was, you know, a couple of years ago and what he is now, where I've been high, I've been low, I've been in the middle on Hoya. Again, the middle ground is where I'm trying to land, where I think this guy can have some solid, especially weak side tank performances. He can carry at times, but he's never really going to be somebody that really actively pushes the team forward, and again, is rather inconsistent. We've seen good and bad out of Hoya, both like the top and the low end of the spectrum. There were games where he looked great, and there have been large stretches of time, especially 2024, where he looked unplayable on the top side of the map. I can only really call him the 11th best top laner. Anything above or below that doesn't feel necessarily fair, because he does have performances that kind of span a range, but him and Satab kind of find themselves in similar positions where I just don't really trust either of them, especially going up against good talent in the LPL in Group Ascend. And that leads us to Xiao Hongren in the jungle. And Xiao Hongren is a very difficult discussion to have, because I've always kind of been against the hype train for this guy. You know, you've heard his name for years. If you've been following the LPL or even the LDL scene, right? Like, you've heard this guy talked about as the next up-and-coming superstar jungler, somebody that should have been starting for Thunder Talk a long time ago if you listen to Reddit comments. But all I've seen in the LDL is somebody who was really good in solo queue that's not really been able to make it work in professional play. He was always like an average LDL jungler, which is not really what you want to see from somebody who's supposed to really break through at the tier 1 level. And he gets his call up after Beichuan is traded over to BLG, and he's not good. He's not really good at all for Thunder Talk. There are a couple of things that he's okay at. He's clearly a good team fighter in terms of his ability to play out games, even from a neutral state, but especially from ahead. He's really good at being able to front to back in those situations. But in terms of consistently generating gold leads, this guy just does not do it. His stats are bad. The eye test is really bad on this guy, and it's always kind of been that. I was always really surprised to see the amount of hype he got as a prospect. Maybe now that he's a full-time starter for the entire split, the more time he spent, you know, learning his communication style within Thunder Talk and taking the role of a more vocal player, because jungle was always the position that was shot called through for Thunder Talk with Beichuan in the past. And so, you know, he's kind of stepping into this big role. Feather obviously adopting a lot of that shot calling responsibility as well. But, you know, there's a lot on his plate, and I just don't know if he's going to live up to it. It's why he ranks so low. My number 13 jungler heading into the LPL split here in summer. I just don't really believe in him as a top tier talent. Maybe he ends up proving me wrong. Maybe this entire team again ends up proving me wrong. But I think the fact that they really kind of shit the bed down the stretch the moment Beichuan left and kind of lost all of their ability to play the map, that really kind of confirmed to me that this team maybe isn't as good as a lot of people were saying they were going to be. I think they're going to be competitive. I think they're better than a team like FPX. I think they can compete with a team like Ninjas in Pyjamas to not be bottom 1 or bottom 2 or even bottom 3, you know, in Group Ascend. But do I think they're ever going to be a team that tries to break their way into the top 5 or 6 like it kind of felt like they could do at the end of winter? No, I think that ship has probably sailed for them. Then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and this is technically the start of my projected playoff teams. Obviously, there's play-in stages, and you have to really earn your way in, but these are the 8 teams that I project will be able to make the playoffs at the very least. And coming in at the bottom of the playoffs, and at number 8 for me, it will be a Group Nirvana team. It will be Ninjas in Pyjamas, and obviously they're a team that's in a quite difficult spot, all things considered, when it comes to just how the splits have gone down, because they were a team that was really rocking in winter, and it really felt like they were going to be on fire. Doingby came back to pro incredibly quickly and, just kind of picked things up when MVP is first split back, all of that stuff, shortened split, whatever you want to say. And then spring was a disaster for this team. I think a lot of people could have predicted that. I had them down at number 7 when people had them a lot higher, but even I was too high on them. 7 was much too high for what Ninjas in Pyjamas were. Last split, they end up missing out on the playoffs. They don't even end up making the playoffs, and so they're down in Group Nirvana, but they should be a team that has enough talent to run Group Nirvana in terms of what their own expectations are. And don't forget that, basically all of Worlds qualification is going to be done through the playoffs themselves and, through your ability to play out the end part of the year. And so even with NIP and Group Nirvana, there still is a world where they make the World Championships. I think with as, contentious as those upper slots are right now, it's certainly not impossible. It's certainly against the grain, but, we'll see if the changes this team made actually make them better. Their lineup is looking like Solo Kill in the top lane, Nayo in the jungle, Doingby in the mid lane, Leave at AD carry, and Niket at support. Obviously, 2 big changes here, Nayo and Niket coming in. We'll talk about them in a minute. Let's talk about the people who have been here all year long, or the 2 players that have been here all year long. The main guy, Doingby, is still here. He's still the core of Ninjas in Pyjamas for what they are in 2025. He's had some really great performances. He's also been pretty inconsistent. He was a reason why they underperformed in spring. I'm not saying he's the reason, but he's a reason why. I think there were a lot of matchups where it just felt like he was getting out-tempoed, early game in particular. It's difficult for a player like Doingby, who I think does want to rely a little bit more on mid-game priority. He's a very good player, and he's got great hands. I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's just, a system player or something like that, that he doesn't have the mechanics to compete at the top of the LPL, because I don't think that's true. I think he is talented, but he's not quite at the same level as like a Knight or a Cream or a Shanks are in a mechanical standpoint, right? And so he can sometimes struggle when losing leads in the early game. We even saw that when he went up against Care, that there were times where he was just down in gold, and even if he was making the right plays throughout the rest of that game, it's difficult when you're at a goal disadvantage to consistently be winning, really in any situation, with just how important stats are in League of Legends. Sometimes you can just wallet and number check your opponent. I think Doingby ran into that quite a bit. Now, when he would win really hard because he would push advantages more heavily, I would think, than a lot of other mid laners. I think that's the fair way to put it, but there are some concerns when it comes to whether or not he's going to be able to be the number 1 player on a team that elevates them to the upper echelon. I think he should dominate Group Nirvana. This should not really be a difficult proposition for him, but the fact that he's there is already kind of the case that, maybe he's not the player everyone thought he was going to be coming back into pro play. You keep Leave as well down in the bot lane. Leave is exactly who we thought he was at this point. Maybe a tad bit more consistent. I think I was more impressed with Leave this past split than I was last year on EDG. Not that that was difficult to do, but like both I think showed similar signs of development in the sense that he's always been a cracked player from a mechanical perspective. Like he is insanely talented in terms of his positioning and his ability to play aggressive in the early game while not giving up free advantages, generating large gold leads on his own. He complements Doingby very well in that sense. But the problem for Leave is that he'll make one back-breaking error every single game, and it's almost always around the same time, basically from 18 to 24 minutes. You have to be paying attention to where Leave is on the map because he's almost 100% going to get caught out, and he's going to die for basically no reason. He's going to give over his entire lead that he's been able to generate, and he does it super consistently. There are so many fights where he steps up way too far and just instantly gets caught. Just a lot of things like that. These avoidable mistakes that need to get cut out of his game in order for him to elevate as an AD carry player. He's just never cut them out. Even going back to that first split on EDG where he really broke out, was rookie of the split, looked like he was going to be able to elevate that team quite a lot. Like he wasn't able to clean up a lot of the mistakes from then. That's still his best split in the LPL to date, and that's not really a great trajectory pattern. So again, hopefully Leave can figure it out. I think he's had a couple of really nice games, but it's just really tough to kind of give a ton of credit to a guy who is going to make some backbreaking errors this split. And then you're also returning Solo Kill. He was replacing Shanji midway through last split, and Solo Kill was really good in terms of coming in and, really impressing from day one. His laning was exceptionally good. He was really consistently able to generate leads, kind of living up to his name, but his team fighting very good as well. Honestly, just felt like a very strong all-around player. He's somebody that if he had a larger sample size in terms of looking like this, he probably would be rated a lot higher than number 8 in terms of my top lane rankings. If he can play just exactly how he did in Spring Split and just carry that across throughout an entire split, like that's a borderline top 5 or top 6 top laner in the LPL, which is obviously really positive, but there are some things he still needs to clean up as well. I think that showcase that he had was a little bit against the grain for what he was on EDG, last year as well, when that team was kind of a disaster. I was a big fan of his on EDG, and I got a lot of comments on here and also on Reddit that were kind of talking about how Solo Kill was really bad in 2024. I was really against the grain. I was kind of pushing for this guy, and when he got the opportunity on NIP, I was pretty excited, but even I didn't expect this kind of breakout. It still is to be determined whether or not he can stay super consistent throughout an entire split. But again, if he can do that, like the small sample size we got of him on Ninjas in Pyjamas was really positive, and I love running him back here as the starting top laner. And then you've got 2 new players, Nayo coming in the jungle, obviously started most of the year for LGD in the group Nirvana and has experience being able to dominate at this level. He kind of is what you were getting out of Leon last year when you replaced Aki with him towards the end of the year, where you just want someone super aggressive that can just play carries and start to generate a lot of gold. I think it's a different circumstance. I think Doingby loves to have a carry jungler. Aki is not that. When Aki had his one breakout year, what is turning out to be kind of a one-year wonder for him in 2023, he was playing a ton of Maokai and Sejuani and a lot of these facilitators, and I just don't know if that works with the style of Doingby. I think having a more aggressive carry-oriented jungler like Nayo in the jungle is more positive for what this team wants to build around, and I think hopefully he'll be a spark plug for what they are as a team. Do I think this is going to be perfect? Maybe not, but this guy was a former LDL MVP. He was someone who I hyped up extensively before 2024, and he just couldn't figure things out until this year on a bad team. If he can carry that through to a better team, that's really nice, and he's going to come in pretty conservatively ranked at number 9, but he could definitely outperform that. And then you have Niket in the support position, another player who's had some really good tape on some really bad teams. I think the RNG split, like, just throw it all out. That entire RNG team was an absolute disaster. I'm not blaming him. I'm not, completely dissolving any blame from him or anything like that, but I think generally, when I'm looking at Niket and when I'm starting to get excited, I'm looking at his 2024, specifically his summer split, where he was really, really good. And if he's going to be able to get that kind of form back here for Ninjas in Pyjamas, Leave and Niket could be one of the more mechanically talented bot lane duos in the entire league. And that is especially true for Group Nirvana. So, I think that there is something to build around here. I think there are a lot of players that have a ton of upside on this team. Basically, Solo Kill, Nayo, Leave, and Niket could all break through and become upper tier players, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised. But I'm kind of betting against all of those happening, because in the same zone as all of them potentially breaking through, they all also have very low floors, and this team is going to be playing in Group Nirvana. Again, maybe they just massacre Group Nirvana and it's like, oh, this team is, top 7 or top 6 or whatever in the LPL, and we can tell, but it's going to be hard to really feel great about this team if they're just going to be beating up on the worst teams in the league over and over again. It's really going to be about how they perform against teams like Thunder Talk and against Edward Gaming that really make me feel better about what this team's upside could be. For now, I think they're good enough to be able to make playoffs, if only because FunPlus Phoenix is probably just not going to be in the race as long as Jue is not starting. But, if they're not anything more than that, if they're just a team that's going to dominate Group Nirvana and then go out in round 1 of the playoffs, then, it's still going to be kind of a disappointing year overall for the team. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and from here on out, we're done with Group Nirvana. It's all Group Ascend all the way to number 1, and that means that coming in at number 7, a team that did much better than this ranking in the playoffs, it's Team WE, and some people might see this as an under ranking, as, looking at a team that just got top 4 that ended up taking down some titans in the playoffs, teams like LGD Gaming and Top Esports that are ahead of them in terms of their standings. They might look at that and say, well, why are WE below them in terms of the rankings? And that's just because I don't know if I trust that they're going to be able to do it again. But you know what? They already did it. And the fact that they are even in this position to begin with, when they were the consensus worst team in the LPL on paper to start the year, absolutely ridiculous. This is already a successful year for WE. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Cube in the top lane, Monkey in the jungle, Karis in the mid lane, Taeyun at AD carry, and Vampire at support. Some pluses and minuses, of course, to this roster. I think generally there's a reason they broke out, and there's also reasons that that they were considered to be low at the beginning of the year that are still present, but overall this team has outperformed their expectations in every conceivable way, and it's all 5 members. Nobody on this team has been a complete liability, and I think that that is generally a huge positive for WE. But you want to talk about the biggest positive, that is Monkey in the jungle. He is the carry, the guy for WE. Whether or not you want to put all of the, success that they had onto him, I'm putting a lot of it onto him. Like in terms of the analysis that I gave last split, you couldn't really look at any of their big wins and not immediately feel the impact that Monkey was making in the jungle. And I do believe that he is the one that's really elevating what WE are doing. I was really high on Monkey last year as well. Don't forget, I was pretty vocal in terms of, kind of a dissenting opinion in 2024 that when Jeje got hurt and left EDG and wasn't able to play the rest of the year, that Monkey coming in made the team immediately better. And I'm not saying that Monkey is a better jungler. What I'm saying is that there was clearly something here to be able to unlock. And I think with the reins kind of given to him after Tianjin obviously didn't work out for WE at the beginning of the year, Monkey's completely run away with that job and completely run away with being the breakout jungler of the year, the Milky Way of 2025, if you will. But I think his success is significantly more sustainable than Milky Way's is, because I think the ways that he wins are significantly more sustainable than Milky Way's, who got exposed at the end of last year. But he's just really good in all phases of the game. Not only is he a fantastic skirmisher, genuinely one of the best early game skirmishers in the league. I'm not going to compare him to Tarzan because Tarzan's just the world-class, best in the world at that trait in particular. But Monkey might be number 2 or number 3 in terms of that particular skill set in the LPL. It's really, really awesome to see him consistently be able to secure objectives because his setups and his execution in those early fights are so tremendous. Do not get this guy on Xin Zhao. He will obliterate you. But even outside of that, his team fight engages have been really nice. I think his mind for the game seems to be pretty sharp. He's not often making gigantic macro mistakes, which is something Milky Way made pretty regularly. Monkey's just a player that I really, really like, and I'm glad to see that he's really broken out here for WE. But you have to have more than one lane in order to be an upper tier team to compete to try to go to Worlds, which WE is right now. They finished in a World spot in Spring Split, and that other lane is kind of in bot lane, which is crazy to say, but Taeyun has been excellent for this team. He's the one player that I think it's also sustainable for. This guy was always a scrim god in the LCK. You heard about it all the time. He would pop off in scrims. He would dominate all these LCK top tier players like Viper and Ruler and Gumayushi and all of them in scrims, and then he would come on stage and he would be the worst AD carry in the LCK by a gigantic margin. He was not very good in the Challengers League either. This guy was just never successful on stage. It was clearly a mental block for him, and honestly at the start of 2025 it looked like things were going to be the exact same, where it really didn't click for Taeyun. It didn't feel like this bot lane was going to be good in any conceivable way. But then during spring something happened. Something in his brain just ended up clicking, and all of a sudden that scrim version of him ended up coming out on stage. His positioning in team fights was gorgeous. His ability to fight in the mid game was really strong, and all of a sudden you were looking at an AD carry that showed elite upside kind of traits. I'm not going to rank him like that because it's really difficult to project that that's going to be the case. AD carry is also the deepest role in the LPL, but Taeyun is a player that I'm really watching out for after completely discrediting him. Remember, I said this, and I'll stand on business when I said this, 2023 Summer Taeyun, I have never graded a player worse than 2023 Summer Taeyun. In any region, in any year, there has never been a player in a major region since I've been tracking my grades that has gotten a worse grade, that has graded out worse than Taeyun did in 2023, and yet here he is still making an impact in 2025. Kind of crazy. But Vampire has also taken a lot of leaps forward. I think, again, this was a player that had very little experience when he first started playing. He was kind of thrust into a starting position going up against, or going into EDG when Mako left that team midway through the offseason to go to Top Esports. But Vampire, of course, had his struggles. We'll just say it. I'm not going to pretend like all the people in the comments that were telling me Vampire was good all along were, correct. Obviously, that's just not true. That is revisionist history, but he's starting to figure things out, and he's gotten to the point where I feel comfortable with him as a starter. Do I think he's a star? No, I still think he does too many things poorly. His laning phase is still just too bad for me to consider him a star. There are many moments in the 2v2 that I think just go very poorly for him, but, I think Taeyun breaking out and Vampire starting to step up his game, starting to get more comfortable at this level and being a big playmaker in team fights, I think that is a good combination. You have players like Karis that I think have found at least a role at this level. Do I think he's consistent? No. Do I think he's basically exactly what Satab is for ThunderTalk? Yeah, I think that's a fair comparison in terms of what he is for this team. I don't think he's a star. I think he's exploitable, especially by very talented mid laners, but we also see him kind of hunker down and just go down 10 CS and be useful in team fights, and, that can be useful as well. Cube has been great as a weak side top laner. It's like he's rewound the clock and just become rare Adam Cube again, which I thought was long gone, especially after how last year went. Really cool to see that coming out of him as well. So WE just kind of feeling like a revitalized version of themselves. If Monkey can continue to grow, this team can make worlds. Like, I know that feels like a crazy thing to say, but it's on the table. I'm betting against that. That's why they're coming in at number 7 for me. I don't think that they're in the same conversation as the top 6. I think they are the best of the rest in terms of how things are breaking down, but if they ended up breaking through, being a top 5 or 6 team, I wouldn't be surprised. Top 4 would be very ambitious, but technically it's possible. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is where I think you really start to get to the teams that could and should make worlds. I know that feels like a crazy thing to say starting at 6 because, you know, only 4 teams can end up making worlds from the LPL, but it absolutely should be like one of these teams. If somebody outside of this top 6 ends up making worlds, that's going to be a surprise, and that's tough news for 2 of these teams, but the one that I think comes in at the bottom, at least for me right now, it's going to be JD Gaming coming in at number 6, and honestly, I did not have this team 6th throughout a majority of the spring split. I had them 3rd, I had them 4th, I had them in that upper echelon. Like, they were a team I really thought could compete to really win the LPL, to go to MSI, to represent the region, and not only do they shit the bed in the playoffs, because I don't think I've ever seen a team with that much hype just completely disintegrate in the playoffs the way that JD Gaming did, you know, not winning a single series, going out in 7th, 8th place. Like, that's a disaster for this organization, considering that they got an automatic bid. They didn't even have to play their way into the tournament. They got Weibo Gaming in a first round draw, you know, like they got the dream matchups overall for themselves, and yet they still were in a position where they went out first, and obviously that sucks, but they also made some roster changes, and I'm not sure this makes their team better. I do think it raises the floor of their team, which is a crazy thing to say for some of these players, but we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Their lineup is looking like Xiaosu in the top lane, Shun in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and Wink at support. 3 players sticking around. The noteworthy one is Pays. Like, let's be honest here, I'm not changing my opinion. This guy is the number 1 AD carry right now in the LPL, and I think he's performed like it all year long. I think what we're learning is that, as it turns out, like, all of the people who were saying that Pays was only good because he was a part of the Gen G system and that, you know, he had a really easy job and didn't have to do all that much, like, to throw it all out. We have overcorrected in terms of, you know, what we're talking about with AD carries and, you know, overhyping people that are on good teams. Like, when I first started this channel, like in 2021, 2022, I really was pushing back on this narrative that just because you play for a good team doesn't mean you're a good player, and I still believe that firmly. I still think that that's the case, but sometimes we really go too far. Pays was a huge reason for Gen G's success. I gave him multiple MVPs on this channel, both in 2023 summer and 2024 summer, in terms of the LCK, and you know what, he comes over to the LPL and he proves that I'm kind of correct for that take, that this guy is just better than every other AD carry in the LPL in terms of his raw mechanics, whether it be early on in laning phases or late game. In terms of his team fighting, he's actually just the best ADC at this level, and I don't even think it's really all that close. I think he's at least a tier above everybody else, so they're going to be happy to bring Pays back. Scout, Shun, they've been fine. Shun's been the second best player on this team by a pretty large margin. Honestly, another good take of mine. I thought BLG was really stupid for getting rid of him. I get that there was some off-the-rift drama, not just in terms of, you know, Shun in particular, but like who he was trying out for and whether or not he was letting the team know he was going to try out for them, or he trying to poach other BLG players away from the team. All of that stuff ended up going down, so I get why they wanted to move in a different direction, but he was a big reason why that team worked last year, and I think we're seeing that. They go to Way full-time, BLG does at the start of 2025, and it fails. They have to go to H1, and even then, they still don't look like the same kind of team. Shun was really a huge part of why BLG worked as a team, and he's been awesome for JD Gaming. He was in the MVP conversation in the spring split. Shun and Pays are the 2 players of why you should be excited and why this team can make worlds at the current moment. You still are bringing back Scout, and while Scout has kind of not been good across this year, I still am a Scout defender in terms of his playstyle. I think he's a souped-up version of a player like Larson. Do I think that that's great for the current meta? No, I don't. I think Quad is a pretty decent example for what Scout's like playstyle is like. I think he's better than Quad, but like that kind of player, if you want like a more modern Western example, like that version of Quad, I think is comparable to what we got from Scout throughout a lot of this year. The issue with that is that he can sometimes fall behind in terms of tempo, and it does leave a lot of responsibility on Shun in particular. Typically, Scout doesn't really work with carry junglers. He wants a facilitative jungler that gives him a lot of resources. But, you know, one of the things I usually don't talk about coaches, but we do have Clearlove coming in here to coach for JDG. Now, it's questionable whether or not Clearlove is an upgrade in terms of the coaching department, but Clearlove and Scout obviously have a lot of familiarity with each other, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that, you know, hopefully hopefully can benefit from that, but Scout could be one of the major ones. Wink as well, who we will get to, could be one of the major ones to benefit from having him as their coach. But I think Scout is fine. Maybe he's worse than this in terms of his production. I'm betting he's going to be right around the middle of the table in terms of top mid laners in Group Ascend. But it's the other two that are really the question marks, the two new players coming in. Wink is coming in as the starting support. This is the one that felt much more obvious, like in terms of something that really needed to happen. Missing was just awful for this team, genuinely one of the most detrimental players in the entire league towards his team's success. He was miserable in the playoffs. He was really miserable throughout all of the regular season. And honestly, he wasn't very good last year either. Like, Missing is just a player that has not been good ever since, you know, Enchanter supports kind of went out of the meta, where you couldn't play as hard for the 2v2 and had to be a lot more focused on roaming and playing engaged supports. Like, Missing's just not an elite player at that style of play. And I think we did kind of see that. Wink is coming in to hopefully stabilize that. Do I think that Wink is like an incredibly good, you know, support that's going to elevate this team? No. I think Jway, if Jway was an option, boy, would I be more excited about Jway coming in than I would be about Wink. But Wink is very stable. I've always been pretty high on Wink as a player. I think he's been pretty good as a support. It took him some time to learn the role, but once he did, I think he turned into a pretty good player, and he's been solid. Didn't have a great spring split, but also EDG was just kind of in a weird spot. So him coming over makes a lot of sense, and I do think he is an upgrade to Missing. Even if he does come in technically with the same grade, Missing would have been a lot lower after spring than 6th. I promise you that. And then the main one that I really need to see whether or not this works out, because I do think there's some risk here, it's going to be Xiaoshu in the top lane. Man, there's some weird stuff going on here in terms of the JDG top lane. They've not been able to lock anybody down. Sheer and Flandra obviously come in last year. Sheer looks good. Flandra looks really bad. Both of them leave and play better than they did on JD Gaming, to be quite frank. Sheer was about the same quality, I would say, on FPX as he was on JDG. He was good in both roles, but, you know, Flandra leaves and becomes one of the best top laners in the entire world, and he was definitely not that on JDG. Alla ends up coming in from Anyone's Legend. They're hoping to upgrade in that spot, and honestly, maybe this is a pushback position, but, you know, the people who voted him for All-Pro, I just don't really get it. Like, did you just not watch the first 4.5 weeks of the LPL? Like, that's really my take, is that for the first half of Group Ascend, Alla might have been the single worst player in the entirety of the group. Like, he was genuinely so detrimental to what JDG was doing. He was down thousands of gold every single game. He was constantly running it in team fights. He was picking split pushers and then not split pushing. Like, I've never seen a player actively go so below his own skill level. Now, he picked things up down the stretch. He was definitely better in the second half of the split than he was in the first half, but that first half was horrible. Like, I get wanting to replace Alla. I actually think it makes a lot of sense for this team, but Xiaoshu coming into the top lane, it's a big risk, man. Like, this is a player who showed a ton of promise and had a ton of upside 3 years ago and has never really evolved or grown as a prospect. Granted, he's been in bad situations. He's never really had the kind of team around him that can give him the grace to kind of learn and grow and, you know, allow him to have more resources on his own without having to feel so much pressure to carry games. But, like, it's never been great for him. He's always just been an average to, quite frankly, slightly below average top laner, and I think he's gotten worse since his rookie split. Hopefully this move ends up working out for JD Gaming. It's a big risk, but for now, it's definitely a wait and see. I just think the floor of this team is too high to rank them outside of the top 6. Pays and Shun, in particular, are simply just too good to not consider upper tier players in the LPL. And if Wink can come in and really stabilize in that bot lane, if they can be a top 2 bot lane at the worst, like, yeah, this team's going to be competing to go to Worlds, and that's even with the solo laners potentially being more up and down. I still like JD Gaming, but there are definitely some reasons to have pause too. Then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, the team just outside my top 4, and a team that I really, really wanted to put in my top 4. It's Weibo Gaming, and it feels weird to have this team at number 5, because honestly, I really do believe they're going to make Worlds. It's just kind of how it goes with this organization. They just seem to find a way. I think that they will be the 5th or 6th best team in the regular season, and they'll be fine in the playoffs. Maybe not make like a top 4 run, but, you know, certainly do well enough in the playoffs to prove their worth, and then qualify through the regional qualifiers. It's just how Weibo Gaming end up operating. I do think that this year will be no different, but for now, I have to keep them at number 5 because top 4 just were a little bit better across the entirety of the year up until this point, even if I do really like the change that they made in the support position. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Breathe in the top lane, Tien in the jungle, Xiaohu in the mid lane, Light at AD carry, and Crisp coming back in to play support. Of course, 4 members returning. They're the members that have been up and down throughout the entirety of the year. You know how it's gone. I can kind of give some context as to what their form is like right now, but generally, you know these players. Like, you're familiar with them. You've watched the LPL. I understand how this goes. We'll start with Breathe in the top lane. Breathe, I think, is getting undervalued, a bit underrated right now. I think that top lane was a bit lacking in terms of top-end performances over the course of the spring split, and I think that there were a lot of moments where Breathe was a top 2 or a top 3 top laner in the LPL, where there were, moments where Bin was underperforming, where it really felt like, a lot of the other top laners outside of Flandra and 369 were really struggling, and Breathe, I think, was the one to step up and really cement himself in that upper echelon once again. Now, Breathe has always been incredibly inconsistent as a player. You just don't really know what you're going to get out of him out of a long stretch of time. Like, there are going to be games, even weeks, that go by where Breathe looks incredible. Games or weeks where Breathe goes by where he looks pretty terrible. It's just kind of generally the pattern that you get with Breathe, where you got to take the good with the bad, but the good was really good, I think, this past split. A lot better than I think people are going to give him credit for, and I think he is an asset to this team. Tien's coming in as my number 5 jungler. If you wanted him lower than this, I can honestly kind of see that. I still really like Tien. I don't think that the gameplay was there this past split. I think it showed up a lot against LGD Gaming, and I think that that's really where people are going to latch onto. But outside of that, I don't think he really impressed me all that much in terms of, last year, where I was really like on the Tien train, and obviously he's somebody who I've been up and down on over the course of this channel's history. I pushed back very heavily on his MVP win in 2022 because it just didn't feel like he was better than his teammate in Knight, who was doing a lot of the heavy lifting for that top esports team, but he more than earned his MVP last year in 2024. It's just not really carried over to 2025. It feels like there are times where this team continues to really push its advantages and, be a Tien kind of team where they're super greedy on the map and taking everything. But, I think he does need to get back into form at least a little bit in order for me to feel like he's a top 3 jungler again, with that position being much, much better than I think people are giving it credit for. Xiaohu coming in the mid lane here, I felt crazy for a majority of the last split because genuinely, there were so many games that he played really well for Weibo Gaming. Were there games where he was atrocious and not good? Yes, absolutely. You can find a couple of games, a couple of series where he was down a lot in terms of resources, where he was making really stupid plays in the mid game to try and play from behind, and he's never going to be all that good in that phase of the game. That's just something you have to accept. But honestly, can you look at 4 or 5 different series last year that he would just straight up won for his team? Yeah, I think that that's also something that's fair. Not last year, last split, in the spring split, I was really surprised when people were like, he's not even a top 5 mid laner. That felt crazy to me in terms of just what we saw on tape, because quite frankly, mid lane is not a good position in the LPL right now. There are not a lot of mid laners that I feel great about, evidenced by the fact that, Xiaohu comes in at number 5, Scout comes in at number 4, spoiler alert, Cream is coming in at number 3. All of these players, to an extent, underperformed in the spring split, but I just didn't feel confident pushing anybody else above them in terms of their performances. And if Xiaohu's going to be the player that ends up playing the best out of all of those, if he's going to be the 3rd best mid laner in the league, are we really going to be all that surprised? I think that's fair. Worth noting that he has a pretty bad reputation for summer splits. Hopefully that ends up changing at least a little bit, but I can't rank him lower than 5th, and I think there's actually an argument that he should be higher than this in terms of the rankings. And then you have Light. Man, you want to talk about disappointment. Tien was good for most of the year. Was he elite? No, probably not, but he was good for most of the year. I think Xiaohu had some elite games and some bad games. Breathe had some elite games and some bad games. Light was just kind of bad in the spring split. Not really sure where that came from. Light has been kind of the pinnacle of consistency, especially for AD carries in the LPL, where every year you can kind of count on him being your B+ kind of player that is consistently going to be generating advantages, is going to be in the upper tier in terms of statistics, can be a number 1 or a number 2 option, but isn't really ever going to show those high-end mechanical traits that lead him to being, the number 1 AD carry in the LPL, right? That's kind of always been where Light is at, and that floor, I didn't think it was going to fall out from under him in the way that it did in the spring split. I have a feeling he's going to be fine, especially with Crisp coming back in, because these two have played a lot together and obviously have had good chemistry in the past. But man, I was not impressed by what Light was in the spring split. He was the one player on this team that I think played the worst outside of Hong for a majority of spring, and he's going to need to fix that. He's going to need to step up again. The spot lane has kind of been a negative for Weibo Gaming, and that's mainly what's keeping them out of the top 4, at least in my opinion for now. But you are bringing Crisp back, and honestly, like, Crisp is pretty solid. Is he consistent? No. Like, Crisp is not a consistent player. He's not somebody who, again, you're going to get good games every game out of. You just don't really have a lot of players like that in the LPL, to be quite frank. But I still will stand on, my opinion with Crisp and say that from a creativity angle and from an engage angle, he still is the most creative support in the world in terms of how he's able to set up for a lot of these fights and the unique ways he's able to find flanks and just creative engages on champions that you hadn't really thought about before. He's kind of an innovator in that regard. Outside of that, is he a perfect player? No, he has decent laning mechanics. Like, he's okay in the 2v2. I certainly wouldn't call it a strength, and I don't think he's a great mid-game player, but as a team fighter, as somebody who can set things up for the rest of the team, I think he's really good in that role, and that's why he's fit with Weibo Gaming in the past, because this team has generally operated a bit more in the 5v5 than they have in, like, a lot of early game skirmishes. Now, will that mesh well with TN? Maybe. I mean, we've seen these two win Worlds together before, so I imagine that there's something there to build off of, but outside of that, like, I think TN's style is much more aggressive, and Chris much more wants to be, I guess, like an aggressive force, but in a more controlled way, if that makes a lot of sense. I think Light ends up benefiting from that. I think Xiaohu ends up benefiting from that. I'm very curious to see what Weibo Gaming's playstyle looks like with Chris coming back in, but for now, do I think this team ends up top 4? If you really had to press me, I would say yes, and I know I'm not committing to that by putting them 4th in the power rankings, but if you really had to ask me, I do think they end up, top 4 making Worlds, but for now, there are just a few too many question marks for me to put them there in terms of the rankings. But then moving on to my top 4. And top 4, as you know, very important. That's Worlds. I know I've talked about it a lot, but coming in at number 4 for me, the team that just edges their way into the top 4, it's Invictus Gaming. And I really couldn't put them below 4th. I think them versus Weibo is a very interesting conversation to have, at least on paper. Do I think that there is a reasonable, conversation to have around Weibo being better by the time, Worlds comes around? I think that's fair, especially with Crisp coming back, and I think that team getting better because of that. But also, are you looking at Invictus as a team that just beat Weibo and just got top 3 in the LPL? Yes, that's exactly what you're looking at Invictus as, and so you're kind of hoping that they're going to be able to carry that form through. Obviously, their roster is unchanged for now, but there is a 6th man being brought in for them that could potentially be playing some games soon, if not, at some point in the future. So we'll go ahead and talk about that, but their lineup is looking like the Shy in the top lane, Jeje in the jungle, Rookie in the mid lane, Gala at AD carry, and Mako at support. The 6th man that's worth bringing up is Wei, who they did sign as a potential jungle replacement for Jeje. We'll get into it as we talk about this. Do I think that that's an upgrade? On paper, definitely not. Like, I think from a pure raw individual standpoint, Jeje is definitely a better jungler than Wei. I think it would be pretty hard to sell me on anything else. Like, I get that Jeje's had some problems over the course of the past year or so, but I was much higher on his spring split than everybody else was. I don't know who they thought was winning games for Invictus throughout a lot of the split. I guess a lot of people thought it was the Shy and Rookie. I don't think any statistic or eye test would back that up, but for me, Jeje was doing a lot for this team. I would be surprised if Wei came in and was like a raw upgrade, but we've seen Wei be able to stabilize teams in the past. Bilibili last year, I think, is a good example of that, and I do think his style fits better with Invictus than it does with Bilibili, because this team does want to play a little bit slower in terms of their style, with players like Rookie and Gala kind of preferring that, and so, maybe it does end up working a bit better, but for now, Jeje is still here, and you know what? Jeje was like an MVP candidate for me in the spring split, and I don't care if that's a dumb opinion. I don't care if people are looking at me as like, oh, what do you see? I watch every single game, and, I've gotten a lot of opinions right, I've gotten a lot of opinions wrong on this channel, but I'm not just going to shy away from it because it doesn't seem like anybody else backs that up. Jeje was a top 3 to 4 jungler in the LPL last split, just depending on how you feel about, a lot of the other junglers. I would say he was top 4 in terms of how things went, and I don't really see this as a problem for the team. I think that they put a lot of trust and faith into his early games, and I think generally his team fighting was really solid last split as well. I think this is a very good player. I think Wei coming in would be, in my estimation, again, a downgrade, but that's only because I'm clearly a lot higher on Jeje than a lot of other people are. I just don't think that this team would be better bringing in Wei, who I am also notoriously low on, who I've been low on since going back to the RNG days. I've always thought that he was a bit more of a system player. Jeje, I think, actually does create his own advantages, and so I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I know that a lot of the LPL community disagrees with me, but Jeje's coming in as my number 4 jungler, and I think he could perform even better than that because he did, quite frankly, for most of the spring split. And then the rest of this team, there's a lot to talk about. We'll get to the solo laners now. The Shy was exactly what you thought he was going to be on the top side, maybe a bit more controlled. He wasn't quite as feast or famine as he has been in the past for teams like Weibo, but at the end of the day, you're still not expecting the Shy to be good every game. If you're expecting that, then you're out of your mind. I don't think he was as good as someone like Breathe was in that feast or famine famine style top lane role. I especially think that he started to tank his own stocks when he just infinitely started picking Nidalee top lane and just really became completely useless in the late game. This guy can team fight. He is a good player in that phase, but there were so many games that were instantly lost. A couple of them I was casting where he just like solo lost the game for his team by not only playing Nidalee and, you know, going 45 minutes, but by making a backbreaking error at 40 minutes into the game, right? This guy just has no map awareness in terms of how to play the late game. He's never had that. It's never been something he's good at. He's a good team fighter and he's a very good laner, and those are skills that are good enough to be able to elevate you, but he is a limited player in that regard. It's why it's hard for me to rank him above the number 6 top laner, and I just don't really see him as an all-pro caliber player. And honestly, at this point, that's kind of how I feel about Rookie as well. Stunned to see this guy get all pro votes over the course of last split. Not because I think he was terrible, but because I just don't really see like the high-end games from him. Like point me towards the elite Rookie performances. I'm waiting to see them. They're just not there right now on Invictus. He's decently stable. He's going to have some decent performances. His laning is pretty solid. His team fighting is okay, but like he did not show elite traits in the previous split. He wasn't dominating people in lane. He wasn't generating gigantic leads for himself all that regularly. This didn't look like Rookie on Ninjas in Pyjamas. This looked like Rookie on Top Esports. Honestly, that's what it really reminded me of. I think it's slightly better than that. The Top Esports here was a disaster for Rookie, but I think it's much more comparable to that than it is to the NIP or Victory 5 years in the last couple of years. And so for Rookie, do I think he has the potential to turn it around? Yeah, I think he was pretty good in the playoffs for this team, which is a huge benefit, but for the most part, I think the solo laners got too much credit for this team's success. I think a lot of it was jungle, and I think quite a bit of it was Gala in the bot lane just being really stable for this team and actively just being a good team fighter. Gala's not the most flashy player in the world, and he certainly isn't the best, like, dominant 2v2 laner, although he can play that style if he really needs to. What Gala's going to be really great at is playing isolated in the 2v2 matchup and going neutral, and then just doing more with those resources as the game continues to go along. Again, it just felt like I had a different read of Invictus with all of the credit being given to the Shy and Rookie, where to me, Jeja and Gala were the two players that were actively winning games for this team, even if they were also actively losing games. I still like Gala. He ends up ranking above players that people like a lot more than Gala right now. I'll spoil it. He's one spot above Hope because of the track record. You know, I think individually speaking, they had, you know, Hope was better in the spring split. I think that's definitely fair to say, but Gala, I think, you know, his track record's better than Hope's, and I think if they were to isolate and switch teams, I think Gala would be just as good as Hope is on anyone's Legend, if not better, and I think Hope would be worse than Gala is on Invictus Gaming. That's still kind of generally my take on it. So Gala still comes in as a top 480 carry. I think he's an A- type of player. I still think he's basically Gumayushi. Like, I really don't see major differences in the way they play the game. And then Mako, man, he's coming in at number 4, and that is a generous ranking. If Missing was the one who got a lot of credit for inting the entirety of the split, Mako's the one who kind of got away with it a little bit more. I can count on 2 hands the amount of games that Mako just instantly lost for Invictus over the course of last year. Absolutely disgusting gameplay from him as a player. The fact that he was considered for all pro by anybody, I don't understand, man. We must have been watching different games because this guy was just not even trying. Gala was doing his absolute best to play 1v2 for most of these games. Mako's obviously great. Like, he's the kind of player that you can call maybe the best support in League history. Like, he's in that conversation. I wouldn't put him there, but I think he has, like, an argument to be there. He was the best support in the world last year from my perspective in terms of being able to create for his own team, and he has followed that up by being a disaster this year. This reminds me so much of, like, the Uzi Mako bot lane for Edward Gaming in 2023, where things were just not working out in any way possible. I don't know, man. Mako's shot calling still seems to be good. This team has decent macro, especially in the mid game, but his mechanics seemed cooked in the spring split. Hopefully that ends up turning itself around. But Invictus was able to figure things out in the playoffs. I know it feels like a pessimistic way to talk about things, but just because I'm lower on Rookie and Mako and the Shy doesn't mean I'm not much higher on players like Jeja and Gala, and that kind of evens out to me feeling pretty similar about this team as everyone else does, just in a different way. They're coming in top 4 because they earned that with their playoff run, but they're on thin ice when it comes to top 4. I'm not sure if I believe this is a Worlds team right now. Then moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this is a team that people are going to think is too high. And honestly, I can't get behind that. I think this is a team that still has to be considered in the top 3 regardless of how things have gone. It's Top Esports coming in at number 3 for me. Boy, has this team had a weird trajectory over the course of this year. They are by far the most dominant team in the LPL across this year if you take everything into account. They end up looking really good for the most part in the winter split. They end up dropping a series to anyone's Legend, but like, okay, AL's really good. good. They go on to finals and they win the finals. They end up kind of upsetting AL, who had beaten them a couple of times up until that point, and they end up being the team that represents the region at first stand. They win the LPL, essentially, in the winter split. But then they go to first stand and they shit the bed in every conceivable way. They end up getting 4th at that tournament, which is obviously not ideal, but honestly, they could have done worse. It could have absolutely been worse. They were in a 3-way tie with North America and Europe to even get out of the group. They could have been the one team eliminated, but they end up going through and they had to face Korea, they had to face Hanwha Life, and so you can kind of excuse them for losing that best of 5, but they come back to the LPL, you know, definitely as kind of pariahs and definitely as the villains of the LPL. And what do? They dominate the regular season. They're the best team in the regular season. Kanavi ends up winning MVP, and it's not particularly close. I know a lot of people started to get on the night train by the end of the split, but Kanavi really was the one that kind of, you know, played the best throughout the entirety of the regular season. And they go into playoffs with all of this hype. They end up, you know, making it through round 1 pretty easily. They get a good draw, and then they lose to BLG, and it's like, well, you know, BLG is a good team. Like, they're maybe the 2 best teams in the playoffs right now. You can't be too worried about that. And then they lose to WE, and they're out in 5th, 6th place, and it's like, what exactly happened here? Like, how did this go wrong? How did this end up crashing and burning in the way that it did? Obviously, there's a lot to talk about in terms of why it ended up going wrong, but let's get to the team first and foremost. Their lineup is looking like 369 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Cream in the mid lane, Jackie Love at AD carry, and Hong now at support. They also made a change, of course, with Crisp going to Weibo Gaming. They needed to get a support back, and it was Hong who ends up coming back in the deal. I'll talk about why I kind of like this for Top Esports and why I think this helps out both teams pretty considerably from a playstyle perspective, but let's talk about the players who are staying first, starting with the one player that I think everybody can agree is really good on this team, and that's 369 in the top lane. It feels like there's been a lot of controversy surrounding the rest of the players, so let's talk about 369 first. This guy's arguably been the most productive top laner in the world so far. He's been excellent for Top Esports, constantly winning in the top lane, not really having bad games. He's super stable as a weak side tank, as we know from the LGD Gaming days, but as I said on broadcast, people forget that this guy was a carry player before he was a super team top lane kind of guy that had to play tanks every game for Ruler and Knight. Like, this guy was a carry top laner for Top Esports for many years, and so him coming back here to this organization, kind of being given the keys to the kingdom again to really take over on the top side of the map, and especially with 1v1ing in the top lane being much more relevant now and leads being both larger and smaller, all things considered, after some of the lane swap changes, like 369 has really reemerged as one of the best top laners in the world. This is a great meta for him. I think he's got a really good meta read in general, and he's clearly in form. But that being said, we've seen this at the beginning of the year before. We saw this last year. He was awesome in spring in 2024, and then kind of wasn't very good in summer of 2024, and so he needs to be able to maintain it. He needs to show that he can keep it up, but right now, he's probably the player you feel the best about on this team. He's my #1 top laner in the LPL, and I don't really feel like that's all that controversial of a take, but the other 2 players that are around them in terms of the rankings, boy, those are some hot takes. We'll start with Kanavi, the reigning MVP here in the LPL, more than deserved, by the way. I get that people are frustrated by the fact that Top Esports is just kind of vilified in the LPL, but Kanavi was the best player in the regular season. I don't think there is a lot of argument over that. But I do understand some of the frustration when it comes to him. First and foremost, one thing I do want to call out, this is a bit of a, you know, a braggadocious moment, so if you hate when I do these, then skip over. I told people at the beginning of the year, like, I don't endorse betting. I certainly don't endorse esports betting just because of how difficult it can be to really, you know, make sure that you're on good sites and, you know, understanding what's going on. Anybody can win a video game. Like, it's just really hard to predict. But I kind of told people, hey, you know, Kanavi, you know, MVP prop this year, pretty good. And that turned out to be a pretty good prediction. So really happy to have gotten that one right. Braggadocious moment over, but Kanavi's still a player that just is the best early game jungler. Like, you want to talk about generating leads and being able to stifle out opposing players. Kanavi still does that at an elite level. Nobody is able to generate leads quite like Kanavi. Maybe Canyon, but Canyon only does that on specific champions. Kanavi does it all the time. Now, is Kanavi great at playing from behind? Not really. Like, he's really not an elite player at having to play from a disadvantage, and that can maybe eliminate him from like the upper tier jungle conversations. I understand why for some people that kind of takes him out of the elite conversation. For me, it doesn't, because his one trait is still so elite and he's still so good in that phase of the game that there is a good 95% of teams that just instantly lose to Kanavi. But the good teams can sometimes be better against a player like Kanavi than they will against junglers that typically perform worse throughout a majority of the year. I get that playstyle wise why that happens. Do I think that that is a concern for Top Esports? For me, no. Like, I still think Kanavi's like somebody you have to watch out for being an MVP type of player for TES, and I think he will will perform like that. The best of fives have not been great this year, but you just kind of have to hope that he turns it around. There's no real reason to sit here and say that it's a, endemic thing for the player. He's had success in best of fives in the past. And then you have Jackie Love. Everybody's turned against Jackie Love. He's another player, kind of like a lot of the Invictus players, that I just feel completely different on than it seems a lot of the other major analysts do right now. I don't get it, man. Jackie Love has to do so much for this team. The responsibility he has on top esports is crazy high. I think his mentality does sometimes hurt him, but pretending like this is some guy who just runs into action and dies trading 1-for-1 is completely disingenuous to how Jackie Love has played the game. I think he's actually gotten a lot more controlled over the past 2 years in particular, and I think that there were moments during the split last in spring where it was oh, is he the best player on the Rift? When top esports was playing anybody, there were definitely moments of that. I'm certainly not willing to give up on Jackie Love. Again, if that's a take that people want to get upset about, whatever, man. I know the community's kind of turned against him. I'm not turning against him. I would still take Jackie Love over almost any other AD carry in the league in terms of pushing my team forward. Now, Cream, I definitely have more concerns about. Cream definitely had his worst split to date in terms of, elevating to the upper station, his worst top esports split to date. Do I think that that's something to be really concerned about? Maybe. I think his playstyle definitely got exposed a bit more. He was losing in the 1v1 a lot more consistently. I don't think it's a great meta for him in terms of the things that he likes to play. Again, that melee mid type of, style. Even the marksman in the mid lane was something he really succeeded on. The Tristana comes to mind, but the Akali, the Sylas, those are the big Cream picks that you think of, and I just don't know if those are the things you want to pick every game right now, or especially early on in a series, but Cream really needs to start stabilizing again. One of the things he was really good at last year, and one of the reasons I felt so good about him going into 2025 was that he was really good at shoving and roaming and playing low resource, and that wasn't something that he did before top esports. He was the main character on OMG. I don't know, man. There are some real concerns that has regressed a considerable amount. He was much, much worse at that than he was last year for top esports. And if that's going to be the case, then yeah, he's going to be worse than number 3. For now, I want to stay conservative in terms of just raising or lowering players, because as you guys know, I do want to, at least give them the benefit of the doubt. Anybody can have one bad split, and Cream's bad split was still the 4th or 5th best mid laner in the LPL, because that role is kind of weak in the LPL right now, but I do think Cream needs to show improvement from what he was in spring. He needs to get back to what he was in winter, to be entirely frank, especially in the winter playoffs. And then for Hong, what a year it's been. This was the pinnacle of consistency in terms of support play, in my opinion, in the LPL. The guy that was every year you just knew what you were going to get out of him, whether he was on a good team or a bad team. His Rare Atom days were great. I thought his FPX days were underrated. He was carrying LWX for large stretches of that period of time. And then he goes to LNG, and things really work out for him there. He just seems to be that guy that maybe isn't elite at anything, but is very good at everything and can kind of be that jack of all trades type of support, and you know what you're going to get out of him. Maybe he's never going to be number 1 or number 2, but he's basically always going to be number 3 or number 4. That did not happen for Weibo Gaming. The Weibo Gaming mind virus infected him. They've not been able to find a support that can stay consistent for large periods of time ever, in the history of their organization, whether it's been On, whether it's been Crisp, whether it's been Hong. Erha looked like he could be that, but they felt the need to bring Crisp back in, clearly to raise the upside of that team. And hopefully Hong can get back to his pre-Weibo Gaming form now that he's left the team. It did really feel like a Weibo Gaming mind virus that really took him over and started making him a lot riskier and a lot more aggressive than he normally was. But again, if he's going to be that super consistent jack of all trades support, that's a better version of what Jackie Love had in Mark for a very long time on this team. And, maybe not as aggressive, but certainly that style of play. So hopefully Hong can come in and be that. I think this could theoretically just be an upgrade for both top esports and Weibo Gaming. Stylistically, I think it makes sense for both of them, but for now, I can't go against the team that really dominated the regular season. I know a lot of people like to throw out the best ofs in the regular season because, oh, if you can't get it done in playoffs, then it doesn't matter. For me, that is a really great sample size to showcase what a team can do over multiple patches, and Top Esports is a team that's been able to succeed at almost all of them this year and just couldn't get it done in the playoffs. I think things will turn around for this team domestically at the very least, and I feel pretty confident having them in my top 3. But that's going to bring us to my top 2 in my power rankings, and you probably know the order of these 2 teams if you've gotten to this point, but coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be Bilibili Gaming, the team that did finish second in the spring split. That's not just the reason that they're getting second here. I do believe that they should be better than what they were in spring, than what they were at MSI. I think it's expected that this team will continue to grow throughout the year. I think there's some rumors kind of circulating that if this team doesn't grow, that they could be making some roster changes, some more roster changes, I should say, considering considering they're already different than what they were at the beginning of the year, and I think that makes a lot of sense for them. I think at some point they're going to figure out how to get the most out of Bin, Knight, Elk, and On, because these players are simply too good to not be near the top of the LPL standings. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Bin in the top lane, Beichuan in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, Elk at AD carry, and On at support. Of course, this is their lineup for the entirety of the year since Beichuan came in to start in the jungle. Of course, Beichuan starting the year off on Thundertalk Gaming. Wei was the starting jungler for this team for the entirety of the beginning of the year. That kind of bled off of the fact that he was their jungler for a lot of last year as well, at least in the regular season before Shun came back in for Worlds. They really wanted to go with Wei. They really felt like that was going to be their best avenue. I was very against that idea. I feel like Wei is the antithesis of the kind of player that they're looking for, at least in terms of their jungle spot. I think Beichuan is definitely much better in terms of a fit, but I don't think he's a perfect fit. But what people forget about Beichuan, because he just came off of a really terrible MSI tournament, and we'll talk about him first here because there are some rumors, but what people forget is that this team was like really floundering before Beichuan came in. Like with Wei, this was not a top 5 team in the LPL. They were the 6th best team in the LPL, and I think even then you could make the argument that they were worse than that. And then Beichuan joins, they go on this gigantic run towards the end of the regular season. They're able to handle top esports in the playoffs. They're able to handle Invictus Gaming as well in the playoffs, and they get themselves to finals. And I get that, you know, they were never really a team that felt like they could win the LPL, although I did kind of predict that going into the playoffs. I was like, oh, I think BLG is going to win the LPL. I was wrong about that. I did feel like they were a team that was a lot better than people remember because they're coming off of a tournament where they quote unquote underperformed. And, you know, I say quote unquote, they underperformed in the sense that they got 4th place, which is generally fine for the LPL number 2 seed, but they did it in a pretty not good way. They did not look competitive against really anybody. They got swept by T1. They barely beat out FlyQuest, and they got swept by anyone's Legend. It wasn't exactly like, oh, this team is clearly, you know, just a couple of tweaks off of being in the upper echelon. No, they felt like they were a tier down from the actual good teams at the tournament, which is never great for the LPL 2 seed, but I'm not going to sit here and say that Beichuan is the only problem for that. This guy's mechanics are average, to say the best. I think that that is fair to say. His mechanics can be, you know, pretty bad at times. There are times during skirmishes where I'm just like wondering what he's doing, and his positioning is not always very good, but he's got a good mind for the game. He seems to have a very good, you know, macro understanding of where he should be at any given time, and while I do think that that can be exploitable by better teams, I think that generally speaking, he does add a level of consistency to this team that Wei just didn't have at the beginning of the year. And do I think this team can do better? Yes. But do I think this team is better with Beichuan than they were with Wei? Yes. Now, the rumor right now, there are a couple of names being thrown out. The big one is Shadow, who is, of course, gone from FPX, currently teamless. If Shadow were to come into this team, it's a completely different style of player. He's definitely going to be able to be a facilitator for, you know, Knight and Elk. I think, ideally, you're looking at, like, 2023 Shadow as, like, the perfect version of what you would want to bring in. Now, is he going to be that? It's hard to know, because 2024 Shadow was definitely different, and 2025 Shadow has definitely been different as a player as well, but if you are getting that 2023 Ninjas in Pyjamas version of Shadow, where he can come in and really make his mid laner look like $1 million, that's all you need to do. The goal of the jungler on Bilibili Gaming is to let Bin, Knight, and Elk cook. Like, if they can do that, if the jungle can just stay out of the way of these best players in the world type of, like, players actually going out and playing the game, then that's the role. But for now, Beichuan is in there. I've also heard rumors that Jeje is potentially available. Now, if Jeje came over to BLG, oh man, like, they're not just number 2, they're competing for number 1. At least from my perspective, that would obviously be the best possible move for them. That's presuming that Invictus wants to go with Wei as their starting jungler, which right now is not out of the realm of possibility, but it certainly is something to keep an eye out for. So if Beichuan is starting here, I still think they're the second best team. Depending on how things go in other situations, I think they could be even better than that, but it's because the rest of this team is so good. Knight's still the best mid laner in the LPL, and I'm going to be honest, like, it's a huge gap between Knight and everybody else. I like Shanks. I think he's a good player, and we'll get to him in the number 1 spot, obviously, but Knight is a full, like, tier and a half above, I think, any other mid laner at this level, and I think especially Knight and Shanks alone are probably a full tier above even number 3 and number 4 in terms of the consistency. Mid lane's just not very good, so having a player like Knight in the LPL is just such an advantage right now, and he really showed that at the end of the split. There were people who gave him their first place MVP votes because of how he played in the second half of the regular season. I couldn't do that because, again, his first half was pretty average, quite frankly, to say the least, but I think when you got into that second half, you started to see him start to unlock himself. And, yeah, that's the version of Knight that if that's going to show up, this team's going to make Worlds and it's not going to be close. They're going to compete to win the LPL. He was even good in the playoffs as well for this team. It just, the rest of the team kind of let him down. Bin had some major inconsistencies. It felt like he was figuring things out. He was much better in the second half of the regular season, which was true for basically everyone on BLG because Beichuan came back in. We're going to say the same thing about both Elk and On as well. But Bin was especially better because he was pretty bad in the first half and then was pretty decent in the playoffs. Didn't have a very good MSI, was kind of irrelevant at that tournament. Elk and On were actively bad, I would say, at MSI in comparison to a lot of the other bot lanes, which was not encouraging. Elk was another player that felt like he was getting a lot more hype than maybe he deserved in terms of what his spring split was. I still believe in the talent level. He's still coming in as my number 380 carry because the mechanics are just elite in every sense of the word. And in my opinion, from a production standpoint, he was the best AD carry in the world last year. Maybe outside of Pays, it was those two kind of going head to head as best ADC in the world. Gumayushi was in that conversation as well, but Elk was incredible, and I think he proved that at Worlds, where he was able to outduel Viper in their matchup against Hanwha Life and, be awesome in the finals against T1. It just has not carried over to 2025. He's not like he's going to choke in big moments kind of player. It's just not really working right now. His 2v2 lane advantages are not nearly as dominant as they were in 2024, and it's weird to talk about On, because coming out of the LPL, I'm like, On is awesome. He's arguably the number one support in the LPL. This guy is dominating. And then he goes to MSI and is like one of the worst players at the entire tournament. Felt very weird to try and rationalize what the problem there was. One of the things that I think On really benefited the most from was Wei's departure. On with Wei felt like a player that was constantly caged, trying to break out of that cage in terms of his playstyle. And then once Beichuan came in, it really felt like On was unleashed in terms of how he could play the game again. Really, in the playoffs, he was the reason this team made MSI. Like, he was the best player for this team in their playoff run, but then they go to MSI, and this guy's like a disaster. He almost single-handedly loses them the series against FlyQuest, and then obviously he's terrible against anyone's legend. Like, it's just a very weird circumstance to see On perform so poorly. Again, a player who was great at Worlds last year, who we know can be big in big moments for this team, kind of feels like an outlier. I'm going to hope and pray that it's an outlier, but for now, BLG, they're coming off of a very bad taste in their own mouth because of MSI and because of the way they perform there, but the talent level on this team makes it like, yeah, they have to be a top 2 team. It's really hard to kind of bet against that at the current moment, especially if they're able to upgrade in the jungle once again with someone like Jeje coming in. Even Shadow, I think, could offer a different element to this team, but even with Beichuan, who I think is fine, by the way, another player who's been a channel darling for me before, like, he offers macro at the very least, and as long as Knight and Elk and Bin and On are allowed to play their own games, are allowed to express their mechanical superiority, this is still going to be one of the scariest teams in the world, and I still think they have a lot of room to grow, considering where they're at from a decision-making standpoint right now. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in my power rankings, and you know who this is. You probably knew who it was going to be before even opening the video. It's anyone's legend who comes in at number 1. There's no argument that anybody else should be at the number 1 spot of these rankings. They are the best team in the LPL until proven otherwise. They were 1 series away from doing that in the winter split by facing Top Esports, and they just weren't able to overcome them there, although they did beat them twice already in that regular season and playoff run to even get there in the first place. And then you look back at the spring split and it's like, okay, this team is, pretty clearly top 1 or top 2 for the entirety of the split. There's 1 week where Tarzan ends up running it down and you're like, is this team in trouble? Because BLG and JDG and IG were all peaking at that time, but turns out, no, they're the best team in the league and it's not particularly close. Then they go to MSI and they take T1 to 5 games. They take Gen G to 5 games, who were the champions of the tournament. And yeah, I feel pretty good that anyone's legend is not only the best team in the LPL, but a team that genuinely can win Worlds if they make a couple of minor tweaks and improve in a couple of areas. My concern, and this isn't even really a concern, is that this team is capped, right? Like, that they are maximizing their own potential already. But if that's the case, they're still a top 3 team in the world, and that's pretty damn good. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Flandra in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Shanks in the mid lane, Hope at AD carry, and KL at support. We'll kind of just go player by player, talking about the strengths and weaknesses, because there's really nothing to predict when it comes to this team. No rumors, no roster changes. This is who they're running with, obviously, as they should be for the rest of the year. Tarzan's the guy. Like, if you want a player who, like, Knight is the highest graded player I have in the LPL, admittedly, but Tarzan is also an A+. They're the 2 A+ graded LPL players right now. I think that that is just undeniable. Like, Tarzan is everything that you want out of a jungler right now in this current meta, and then some. And I hate to just take Victor victory lap after victory lap, but boy, howdy, was I standing up for this guy at his absolute lowest. And boy, was I getting a lot of pushback. 2022, 2023, when there were people literally waiting outside the LPL arenas to boo and mock Tarzan as he left, when Reddit could, you know, not sit 4 minutes without going, oh, Tarzan's the problem, Tarzan's the problem, Tarzan's the problem. Every week on this channel, every single week I was coming on and being like, you all are stupid for doubting Tarzan, you all are scapegoating a player that doesn't deserve to be scapegoated, and he's going to figure things out. He got that LNG team to Worlds in 2023. He goes to Weibo after being dropped because, oh, you know, the grass is going to be greener with Weiwei on the other side. Obviously, that was never going to be the case, but he gets picked up by Weibo midway through the year, and all he does is drag that team as the #1 player to the semifinals of Worlds. Okay, that seems like a pretty good outcome, so he goes over to Anyone's Legend, and all he is this year is the best jungler in the world. Like, I think there's a debate. Canyon's been incredible. He's been really good, but Tarzan's job is so much harder than Canyon's, and I think Tarzan's playstyle is so much more versatile than Canyon's. I would take Tarzan right now over any jungler in the world, and I'm just so happy to have been on the hype train early. Tarzan is the channel darling in the jungle. He's the player I've gone to bat for over and over and over again on this channel, and I'm glad to see he's finally getting the flowers he deserves. He finally won the LPL. Hopefully Worlds is next. And then for KL, in the support position, you want to talk about another player who I've gone to bat for since day one. This guy was a rookie in 2022 when I was covering the LCK, and I could not stop talking about him. It was getting really annoying to people in my LCK videos. I know that because people in the comments kept saying that, all right, man, you need to chill on the KL hype when he was on Live Sandbox with that Prince and Croco team that ended up really overperforming, almost getting to Worlds. Like, I was really hyping this guy up, even more so than Prince at times, who was really getting a lot of the recognition. I continued to hype him up when that team was a disaster, quite frankly, in 2023. 2024, there were moments of great play and moments that were average, and I think that was, you know, cool to see. Like, there was, you know, breakthrough potential from KL, but 2025, it's all been put together. He's the best map controlling support in the entire world. When you want a vision-oriented support, you call KL. There is nobody, maybe outside of Beryl, but Beryl's gonna have bad plays. There's nobody who controls the map in the way that KL does. Out of the support position, he's an expert level team fighter. He's a very good laner, and that's something that's really been a development for him in the 2v2. He is everything you want. I'm not saying he's the best support in the world. I don't think he's the best support in the world, but I think he's in the conversation, and that's really impressive. He's coming in as the #1 support in the LPL. The other players on this team are still pretty damn good. We're already talking about the bot lane, so let's get it out of the way here. Let's talk about Hope, who does come in as my #5 AD carry. People are going to get really upset by this, I would have a feeling, or at least people are going to disagree with this. I understand. He's not performing like the #5 AD carry in the LPL. My thought process is that I'm trying to stay team agnostic in terms of these rankings, and Hope is a player that if you took him out of Anyone's Legend and threw him onto a different team, do I think he would play the way he's playing right now? Probably not. I think we've seen that in the past with him on WE and JD Gaming. Even when he has been successful, he's never really played quite like this, but this is a player in Hope who would not even have been close to top 5 at the beginning of the year. The fact that he's here right now is already like oh yeah, he's taken that leap. He's become, you know, what Light was for Weibo Gaming for so many years and for LNG for so many years. He's kind of Gala-esque in terms of the kind of performances that he's able to give, and that's a really big compliment. I don't want people to feel bad about that. If mid lane is very shallow in the LPL, AD carry is pretty damn good in the LPL, so I'm certainly not trying to take anything away from Hope. Do I think he does anything at an exceptional level? Probably not. I don't think he's elite in any category, but he is very good at most things, and that plays off of this team very well. He's oftentimes the secondary carry no matter what the game plan is, and that's a very valuable thing to have. You have Shanks in the mid lane. This has really been his breakout year, I would say. He's kind of been building towards this breakout, though, for a long time. It almost doesn't even feel like a breakout. It just feels like every year he's taken one step up in terms of his performances, and this year was just another step up, and, you know, by the time he's taken enough steps, he's like a top 2 mid laner in the LPL. That's kind of just how it's been over the last couple of years, and so it's not shocking to see him near the top of the rankings, but it is really good to see that he has cemented himself as one of the elite mid laners, especially in a weaker mid lane pool right now in the LPL as an aggressive melee-oriented mid laner. And then Flandra, talk about a turnaround. This guy was a weak link for JD Gaming last year in their attempts to make Worlds, and he comes over here to AL and kind of proves that it was a team problem. It wasn't a player problem. This is maybe the best year he's had since 2021, since he won the World Championships. It's been really fun to watch. He's clearly an upper-tier top laner in terms of the world rankings, and yes, I know he likes to stick to certain champions right now. Yorick, Ornn, Sion, like those 3 are definitely going to be the 3 you have to watch out for, but he can still play everything else. He's not even pulled out some of the crazy pocket picks he got known for in the first place, like the Graves top in a while. So I just feel great about AL. You feel great about AL. If you're watching this, you know that they are the team to beat in the LPL. They're a tier above everybody, including BLG, including Top Esports, including Invictus. You know, whoever you want to put in that next tier is totally fine. AL has to be number one in terms of expectations right now, and that is just so awesome for an org that's tried so hard to get here. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Again, let me know what you agree or disagree with down in the comments. There's going to be a lot that you disagree with, especially for things like the LPL where there's 14 teams to kind of talk about. There are going to be big disagreements in terms of rankings, and generally, I know my opinions on the LPL are not quite as common as maybe they are for some other regions. I'm not quite as consensus on the LPL as I am for other regions. Obviously, North America takes the cake for that right now, but the LPL, I definitely have some opinions that are against the grain. So let me know if you agree or disagree with all that down below, and get excited for this split. One thing to announce, I will be returning as a color caster for LPL English over the course of this split. So if you are excited to hear me, give my live thoughts on a lot of these games, then, go ahead and subscribe to LPL English. Of course, the link to that is in the description. Please go ahead and follow them. My first casting series is going to be the night of, I guess it's Monday night, like Tuesday morning, however you want to classify it depending on your time zone. It's going to be the series of LGD versus Ninjas in Pyjamas, and then it will be WE versus Invictus Gaming. So go ahead and check those out. I will be live on cast for those, but we'll be covering the LPL every week on this channel anyway, so if you can't make those, that's perfectly fine. You can still catch the videos as they come out, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get these videos out to a lot more people. We spend a ton of time watching not only, tape from last split to make sure that we're all caught up and, giving it a double check, but watching tape on the new players that are coming in as well to make sure we know as much about them as we can. So it really would mean a lot to me if you hit like and if you hit subscribe. Again, we're going to be posting more about the LPL, so stick around for that. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all